Section 2 of Misleading of the African Mindset Volume 1 of 2. African Continent Battles. The African continent battles are the fights against all systems made to control its people. These systems started in the 15th century up to date, 21st century. The systems are continuing to limit the majority of Africans' mindsets. In addition, it's also the fight against our own mindset, Africans, that has been set over centuries within generations. These mentalities, mindsets, tears us apart with radical thinking, by seeing each other like enemies, which fail us to be united to solve our endurance problems: poverty, joblessness, xenophobia, crime, wars, corruption and jealousy, among others. These battles started in the before Common Era, BCE. However, they are mostly revealed to us in the first millennium CE, 1 to 1000 years, Common Era, among African empires and kingdoms between our grandparents, who were divided, slightly then, in different areas, but they were still connected in cultural rules. The majority of the earliest African families or civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa are the descent of the West and East Ancient Africa Kingdom families, as discussed more in Section 5 Volume 2 of 2. In the late Middle Ages, 15th century, the European empires, primarily the Portuguese, started to explore Africa. They brought with them many systems and used Africa's diverse relatives, African subfamilies, as an opportunity to separate them, in order to take control of some African lands. Most of these subfamilies were divided and ruled under the names of brothers who migrated to different areas but shared the common cultures and histories. Later, some of these different names gave birth to several African kingdoms and languages with the influence of some European languages. This is the result of Africa's diverse languages to date. In the mid-15th century, CE, the Portuguese started to explore the western coast of Africa. These voyages were sponsored by one of Portugal's princes known as Infante de Henrique, commonly called in English, Prince Henry the Navigator. In the following years of the 1400s, the Portuguese explorers embarked into the slave trade. They imitated the Arabs who started, slightly, slavery in Africa during the rise of Islam, in the west, east and north of Africa areas, in between the 7th to 10th centuries, CE. This slave trade and other trades, namely, gold, copper and iron, among others, attracted other Europeans, starting with Spain, then England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, who later became the United Kingdom, and followed by the Dutch Empire, Netherlands, France and Germany, among others, who joined the Portuguese in Africa. However, the presence of other Europeans led to competition, conflict and civil wars between them. These conflicts were started by the Portuguese. They first fought some civil wars against some African Islamic states, which was supported by the Arabs, who dominated some of the African kingdoms' trade through Islamic rules, before the presence of Europeans. In the following years, the Portuguese again fought other civil wars with other Europeans present, as well as the African kingdoms. After the Europeans started to explore America, in 1498 Christopher Columbus sets foot on the Central American continent for the first time. Following years, the Europeans boosted the slave trade in Africa. This trade was also supported by some African leaders, who by then were introduced to more advanced types of weapons that were used to capture some other African followers, who were then sold to the Europeans. Due to the huge demand of labor needed in American plantations, this caused many conflicts and divisions among African kingdoms. The majority of them were buying the weapons from the Europeans to defend themselves against other dominant African kingdoms, who captured them and sold them to the Europeans as well as to some other pitiless Europeans. This also caused some civil wars and many divisions among Africans. Today, in the 21st century, these African mentalities of dominating or bullying other kingdoms with the support of European weapons industries has taken another form of ethnicity group domination. These are the main causes of many civil wars or division in African countries. Later, the Europeans compromised with each other, in order to maintain their individual control interests and avoid fights. They came up with ideas of dividing African areas. This included African families, lands and kingdoms. The division was like in the manner they did themselves throughout the two divisions of their empire, the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, in between the 3rd to 5th centuries. Later, the ideologies of the religion, Christianity, also led to many acts of divisions. They started first with the division of the headship of the Church, called Church Fathers and the Oriental Orthodox Church in 4 CE. It was followed by the schism of the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church in 11 CE, 1054 CE. Afterwards, came the rise of Martin Luther's philosophy of protesting against the Catholic rules in the 16th century, started in 1517 CE. Another branch of Protestantism had started to formulate. The religion conflicts caused several civil wars under European civilizations, especially between the 10th to the 19th centuries. This resulted in the formulation of several European countries, while the majority were the provinces or part of the Western Roman Empire, also called the Holy Roman Empire in a different period. In the following years, these provinces were named after different separate countries and kingdoms, as described on the map of Europe today, 2018, which is composed of 50 countries. This includes the 28 countries of the European Union, EU. Furthermore, the Europeans brought their philosophies and managed to divide African areas into several countries in the 19th century, as evident in the African map, with 55 countries, in 2018. This was done by force without consulting any African leaders. Consequently, we find today some part of one family who speaks the same language fell to one side of the neighboring country, and others remain in the other countryside. However, due to lack of understanding of many young Africans, when they see their neighboring brothers or sisters visiting their country, they call them foreigners. They see them like enemies, because of the European ideology of dividing African areas, 2 centuries ago, has sharpened African mindset to a DTCTC thinking. This system continues to fail us, Africans, from enjoying or having a total peace of mind in our continent or lands. This is because our grandparents were divided and separated by the system called borders. To enter another side you must have authorization, as discussed more in section 5, volume 2 of this book. This was achieved after the Europeans abolished first the slave trade, in 1865, and got involved more into agriculture, like the plantations of natural rubber, cotton, palm oil, among others, as well as mineral exploitation. The new trade requested more hectares of free lands, which were owned by African kingdoms. They started to cause several conflicts among each European and African kingdoms, for land invasions. In 1881 the scramble for Africa, the invasion, occupation, division, colonization, and annexation of the African territory by European powers, started. Later, the scramble for Africa among the European powers led to the Berlin Conference, which was held in Germany to discuss how to divide Africa in between 1884 to 1885. They turned around these subfamilies' names by the emphasis of ethnic distinctions, also known as tribes. They promoted the religion missionaries, Christianity, to influence African old belief systems that belittled some of the African faiths, with the outcome of losing confidence in our ancestors' systems. This was done in order to control individual lands and explore the land for agriculture, as well as the minerals. It has also allowed them to take total control over the African people and lands, for several years. In the late 19th century, they started the colonization for individual control, after succeeding in the division system. Later, they imposed many systems of division, by changing the African kingdoms into countries and sub-areas. This included many types of businesses and ethnic group divisions, identities, skin colors and religious distinctions. visas or permits to visit other African areas, weapon businesses. Furthermore, most of the African countries or areas were under the control of two strong European power countries, France and Britain, UK, and the remaining areas by other Europeans. These land occupations and other international issues led the Europeans into many other conflicts that led them into two massive civil wars, which they referred to as World Wars. In 1914 to 1918, World War I took place, which led the German African land colonies to be taken by other Europeans, especially by the French, British and Belgians, in 1916, as discussed more in the next pages. In the 20th century, the Africans fought for their independence and managed to free themselves from the colonization systems, from whom the majority were freed in 1960. However, the divisions constructed among African people's mindsets turned us into the best customers of ex-colonizers' weapon industries. After the African independence, the oil and other mine industries had become the cause of many disputes or conflicts between African ethnic groups, leadership and countries. This has continued to lead us to kill each other and has caused numerous civil wars and the death of many African families until to date, 2018. Many Africans' deaths are caused by their kin, without the understanding of the hidden hand, the vision of these men who invented these oil, mine and weapon industries. Today these systems remain our default mindset and have brought many other battles throughout the continent. While some of the Western leaders, in a bid to maintain their interest, have always had a hand in African political systems, to make sure that the African economy and mindsets are always under their control, this is done to maintain the world balance through their control. The African Youth Inventions Company's philosophy is focused on innovating many systems that will challenge the colonial mindset which has been planted through our families. In order to free African countries economically, we first need to free ourselves from the inherited mindset by introducing some new systems that will break all the confusion. This section has been included throughout this book to disclose some of our mistakes we adopted from our grandparents and the Western ideologies, with some solutions proposed for them. The world's opportunities through African youths. The African continent measures 30.2 million km2 with an additional continental shelf area of about 1.28 million square kilometer. It is the second largest and second most populous continent in the world, with an estimated population in 2018 over 1.2 billion people. In 2016, the African Union reported the population of Africa of about 1.203 billion. Africa is bounded by the Mediterranean Sea, in north, the Red Sea, in northeast, the Indian Ocean, in east and south, and the Atlantic Ocean, in west, south and northwest. The continent has 5 regions: Northern, Eastern, Western, Central, and Southern Africa. These 5 regions are subdivided into 8 zones: the Sahara, the Sahel, the Ethiopian highlands, the Savannah, the Swahili coast, the rainforest, the African Great Lakes and Southern Africa. Currently, in 2018, Africa is the continent with the highest youth population in the world. According to the State of Africa's Population 2017, African Union, the continent's population of the under 15 years count about 40%, followed by 56% who are between 15 to 65 years, and 4% are over 65 years. This is clear then, that in 2018 about 65 to 75% of over 1 billion of the African populations are under 35 years of age. Despite these potential numbers of youth, some of the African leaders continue to miscarry the continent. They are failing to use these massive youth as an opportunity to transform the condition of the continent. This failure is due to the misleading of the African mindset, with the support of some radically corrupt leadership. Some of the African leaders utilize the DTCTC system to control their citizens. They maintain power for long periods, like kings, and obtains support from some Western leaders, whose interests are controlling the African economic and political systems. In return, the DTCTC system, which tore African people and countries apart after the end of the colonization era, took another form of mental and economic control. Today, most histories and technologies which have changed the world have been developed by people between 15 to 35 years of age. However, a large percentage of youth on the African continent remain unproductive in creativities, which leaves Africa's development lagging behind the rest of the globe. The current number of African youth can lead Africa to the top of the world's continents. They can make Africa more competitive, more creative and more inventive. The continent's youth can also make Africa a better and safer place to live in if all Africa's religious, political and cultural leaders and the rest of the African elders can promote many ways of inspiring the youth. By introducing modern cultures and systems, this will free some Africans from enslaving themselves through their own mindsets. African people were enslaved and colonized by some of the Western countries' leaders or governments in the last 460 years, from the 15th century to the 20th century. Today, in the 21st century, we are economically controlled within the DTCTC system. This system has created inequalities between those controlling, masters, and those being controlled, slaves, and this system of mindset domination remains with us today. One of the African American doctors said, "There is a slave master working about in our head. We have become our own slave masters. We have that policeman working in our head." The majority of African people have become the slave masters of themselves, through our own mindset. We have continued allowing the ex-colonization countries to colonize us mentally and economically through the DTCTC system, with the help of some of the African leaders. This has, over the years, led to depression and unproductivity in the African people. In the 21st century, most African youth still need much assistance with their dreams stolen by some of the African leaders and institutional systems. As a writer, I encourage that all Africans would have opportunities for improving their lot in life. However, this can only happen regularly if we continue working together, harder and supporting more African youth's dreams. I wish you too, as a reader, will do something about Africa's youth through youth ability programs and development initiatives focused on African youth and their dreams. I have also been involved in the initiative to start AYI shows/debates, AYI books/magazines, AYI newspaper, and MSD courses, mindset and skills development courses. These are realized in a facilitated multidisciplinary research company, the African Youth Inventions, AYI. Its main purpose is based on enriching the mindsets of youth, and to innovate systems of education to improve the quality of life of the people. The company was initiated to inspire, cultivate and motivate Africa's youth with a program that will focus on skills and mindset development. For more info, you may visit the AYI website, www.africanyouth.inventions.co.za. A secondary aim, for anyone reading this book, especially if they are engaged in any way with education, as either a student or educator, is to continually mobilize support across the continent. This is to bring the winds of change, to continue to face Africa's problems head-on, by primarily improving systems of education across the continent. These will challenge colonial mindsets and set in place additional systems of critical thinking and engagement. The focus of this new approach will be a brand new subject, which will deal with mindset development for all African youth. This will be achieved by developing strong leaders and people, with a modern African mentality within all African primary, secondary and tertiary schools. To date, mathematics is a compulsory subject in all African education systems. It promotes skills development and assists us with logical analysis, deductions and calculations, among other subjects. The current compulsory subjects in the continent's education system are not sufficient for changing African mindsets, which is the key to the development of youth on the continent. We need to introduce another compulsory subject that will only focus on changing our youth to a new mentality, in order to break the shackles of an enslaved way of thinking and bring more changes within African people, from unproductive to productive. This is one of the reasons why a company has introduced the AYI shows, debates, by running series of debates to listen to African people about what will benefit our continent and to motivate and inspire our youth. This will help us to find a way to introduce a new supplementary subject in African education systems. It's also to attempt to resolve other frustrations of the people on the continent. We hope to introduce many other books, based on the brand new compulsory subject that may focus on the key concepts and ideas central to the DTCTC system. This includes the type of training that we may offer to the educators. The new books could be written by taking the collection of African people ideas, how they wish to see their continent tomorrow. The goal is to offer this program across Africa, from elementary, high schools and tertiary education. This, in order to start changing the viewpoint of all African youth to produce additional youth with a better critical vision, not to depend only on African government offers. Instead, to start working as a productive youth and become part of the solutions. Take, for instance, a poor child living in Soweto, a township of the city of Johannesburg, RSA, who would love to continue with his education. The parents may not financially be able to support his education with books and transport because they do not have much money. However, the parent might still be capable to afford a bit of daily bread for his stomach to continue his high schooling. If this child does not have motivation systems or mindset development around him, he may quit school. Thereafter, the paths open to this child's future lying along the direction of the criminal world, prostitution and hopelessness. This failure to develop our youth's potential is a huge loss for the continent when one young person stops believing in his dreams. Maybe his dream would have saved the world, but we would lose his ideas due to education systems, which have neither their will nor the ideas to motivate him. However, this would not be, if there were programs or people that would narrate to him the histories of people who were in the same situations as he currently faces. In spite of this, have succeeded in their lives and impacted the world. This would enable him to believe and focus on his dreams, and inspire him to continue to work hard and become a productive being. This course will make him believe there is hope for his life, a class not to be missed. Even if he failed to finish his formal schooling, he can still believe in himself. If he attends this class for more than 2 years, he will still have the inspiration of others who have succeeded, to motivate him, men of science, like Thomas Edison, and political leaders, like Nelson Mandela. People who have struggled through the darkness and poverty throughout their lives and found a way through that darkness into the light on the other side. For example, in school, the young Edison experimented much. This was despite a misperception that it might stop him from achieving his dream because his teacher couldn't keep up with his questions. This ended Edison's 3 months of official schooling. However, his mother did not give up on him. She continued to teach, motivate and inspire him to follow his dream at home. Edison ended up making a significant impact in the world. He invented the phonograph, the first device to record and reproduce sound, the kinetoscope, the first motion picture film projector, a long-lasting, the practical electric light bulb, among other inventions, after having failed many times in his life. The difference is that in Africa, most of the parents are traumatized, and some have lost hope, due to the African conditions. This has automatically affected the next generations. We do not have many parents who think like Edison's mother, who inspired him to believe anything is possible. This has become a barrier to shift Africa to another level and to change the African young's mindset. However, we do have access to the majority of these young kids from primary and high school, in which African leaders can use these opportunities to introduce a compulsory subject that could stimulate our youth to start thinking out of the box and build the Africa we are dreaming of. In the case of the likes of Edison's mother's thinking and support, the African kid will do better. It's likely such a child could do even better than Edison, as he is standing on the shoulders of more giants of the past, which gives him access to every discovery that has taken place in the world since Edison's day. Now we have access through the computer, where information is at our fingertips if we learn the ways to find and critically engage with this information. The lesson taught is that the most important point to learn during our lives is how to take control of our personal mindsets and therefore, our own lives. Another example is how some of our leaders hasten to buy weapons from the Western leaders, doing roaring businesses out of our mindset. They then give us the tools to go and kill our families without thought, and after the deaths, the same leaders come with the solutions. It could be argued that our African families' deaths might even be the ultimate gain by this strategy, in their eyes. The course will primarily be concerned about the motivation and inspiration of African youth, to allow African kids to be productive. All the positives and negatives, events, such as achievements and losses, must be included within a program of each daily class. This is to start inspiring our children to love more and hate less. To practice more love and work hard, to believe in what they think is good in their lives and for others. This program, because it is focused on all three levels of education, will capture all of Africa's youth, although all learners may not necessarily attend university. This deliberate approach that focuses on compassion, critical thinking and problem solving will make an enormous impact on the African youth. This will sharpen their ability to transcend the mindsets and mentalities that have historically enslaved Africans' mindsets for generations and have contained and restrained African potential. The program will make an impact through the African generations. Today, in 2018, if most of the African people are suffering, some of the causes are our own mentality, as mentioned above. We have become our own slave masters under some of our 21st century leadership. People are affected through the educational systems which only focus on skills and knowledge while ignoring the critical development of the mindset. These systems have destroyed and continue to confuse Africans by unproductiveness and filling them with negativity. An unproductive youth is the biggest undoing of the African continent. For example, the population growth of Africa will double the recent demand for food in the next 10 to 15 years. From 2010 to 2017, this demand has been met increasingly by imports from the global market. To date, in 2018, the rising global food prices bring high food import bills, which continues to affect the large African families' financial growth. Lacking more youth creativity or productive and strong regional trade, which may offer us the potential to advance food security and growth, they are not being much explored. If we look at the statistics of Africa's past and present economic failures, we can see that despite Africa's annual food aid of $33 billion in imported food, as reported in March 2010 at AYI, the Economic Commission for Africa, African people still live with chronic hunger. In 2014, the chair of the Africa Progress Panel reported Africa's food import bill was worth $35 billion, excluding fish, every year. The foreign investors were, and are still increasingly choosing Africa as a lucrative opportunity. They are pouring money into agribusiness and others businesses. At best, these investments bring jobs, finance and critical knowledge. My viewpoint is, African people and their governments are still taking longer to create their own investors. On the 8th of September 2016, the president of the African Development Bank Group spoke in Nairobi in an exclusive interview at the African Green Revolution Forum, saying Africa's food import bills still stood at $35 billion annually. However, the results of many African economies are vulnerable to fluctuations in commodity prices. The continent remains home to the world's highest proportion of poor people and to a growing youth population. The World Food Prize Laureate 2017 took place at Iowa State University, Des Moines, Iowa, USA on October 17, 2017. The president of the African Development Bank said Africa still spends US $35 billion annually on food imports, describing it as unacceptable. He also said Africa sits on 65% of the uncultivated arable land left in the world, so what Africa does with agriculture will determine the future of food in the world. By his estimates, if the current trend continues, Africa is estimated to spend US $110 billion by 2030 on food imports. If we compare from 2010 to 2017, it shows us that African leaders are still struggling to feed their people. This is also due to lack of production and transformation of their youth into producers and investors. However, we have been and have continued to wait upon foreign interventions for solutions. The African Union's Agenda 2063 to industrialize the continent may bring solutions to these matters. At the same time, if we fail to change the educational systems, or develop the mindset of African people, we will break repeatedly. These new industries and infrastructure will stand desolate as we did several years ago. We have continued doing the identical arguments and destroying some of our achievements. This mentality may continue to lead the African generation's lives to deteriorate due to the same conditions. In the 21st century, about 50% to 80% of African food, medicines and other goods and material, transportation, devices, etc., are imports from other continents. Surely it is a big mistake for African people to consume more from outside the continent and less made within the continent when we do not have many jobs. We are indeed creating jobs for other continents. By inspiring, motivating and driving our African youth to be more productive at young ages, this will allow us to make our own food, and other goods. At least 70% to 80% of our food could be produced by ourselves. That way, we could create hundreds of thousands of jobs within the continent, and prices of goods would come down and be more affordable. The unproductive continental youth have let their leaders down, and this leads the continent to depend on other continents' people, effort and products. Automatically this weakens the continent leadership to continue seeking backing for support from other continent authorities. This is one of the reasons why most of the African leaders behave the same. They seem to see some Western leaders like gods, whereas they are only humans with the same features as any African leaders. For example, mostly, when some of the top Western leaders announce a visit to some African countries, the particular leaders throughout the host countries will embark on cleaning roads. They also spend money repairing and painting infrastructure to showcase the countries, without implementing any real improvement. At the same time, after the foreign dignitaries have left, everything reverts to the previous status. To illustrate this, let us look at the visit of the 44th President of the United States to Kenya on the 24th of July 2015, after the announcement of his visit in June. Kenyan leaders embarked on a so-called refurbishment program. Some of the Kenyan homeless families during this period were moved to a primary school temporarily until the visitor had left the country. Later, everything reverted to the usual conditions. This is clearly visible on news reports in KTN, Kenyan Television National News, available on YouTube during this period. In other examples, some other African countries' actions echo this behavior. However, if any other African president, like, for example, the president of Ethiopia, announces a visit to Kenya, groundwork preparation is low-key because he is an African president. Should he visit any American or European country, nothing will happen in those countries. Do we as Africans value someone from outside of the continent much more than we value our own families? This prevents us from getting together and sharing ideas, which would lead us to develop our continent faster because we don't trust each other, and we see each other as enemies. We even have been calling degrading nicknames to other fellows Africans when they visit or live in our country. Some South African citizens can be heard calling other African people Krekweer, plural, Amakrekweer. Some Congolians, Congo Brazzaville, call the West Africans who reside in Congo Bawara, plural, Bawara. Furthermore, some can be heard calling their Congolese neighbor, Dr. Congo, using their old identities, Zarios Ongala, plural, Bazarios or Bangila. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, it is the same echoes, while some people call the West Africans Wara, plural, Bawara, and call their neighboring Congolians Lia, plural, Balia. In addition, other African countries have different nicknames. All these names are derogatory in nature, but we rarely have derogatory names for people from other continents. It appears that the colonial mindset that has influenced our ways of thinking in the past few hundred years had constructed a racial hierarchy. In it, we value the American and European above the African in our own minds. We seem to have the same problem with the naming of different ethnic groups within Africa. In the Congo-Brazzaville, the three distinct ethnic subgroups of Bantu, the Mbochi, Lari, and Bimp have destroyed the country through contested political control. This has led to civil wars, because of a lack of understanding that they are all descendants from one family of the Niger-Congo. Other African countries experience the same problem. We will continue to encounter these problems, if we don't allow African youth to become more productive and re-educate their mindsets, to teach them about our failures and success histories properly. Always be on the alert for potential conflict, even when your country is at peace, with mindsets that enslave us. It is quite difficult to identify likely trouble and strife. It is our responsibility as both African and global citizens to voice our concern for all the troubles across the globe, because these conflicts have the power to destabilize. When others are in trouble, and we remain silent, that is a big mistake. We can see the Middle East conflicts and wars continuing to fail the dreams of their youth for decades, with the influence of the DTCTC system supported by some Western leaders. We have seen this happen in Africa from north to south and east to west, for tomorrow it might be your country as well. It might fall into chaos and destroy the dreams of citizens across your land. Due to low productivity within African people, confusion took over many people's mindsets to keep on blaming our leaders for everything that they failed to complete. This is affecting the continent to progress rapidly and allows all African countries to face the same problems. For example, I have been residing in South Africa since 2006, to date, 2018. I saw similar problems I used to experience in previous years in my country of birth, the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville. Despite the problems and devastation in the Republic of Congo, there are problems common to many countries in Africa. The infrastructure in Africa is very uneven, despite South Africa's structural sophistication. In the 21st century, I lived in the environment, lacking electricity for short period episodes in 2015, a similar experience encountered in the Congo more than 10 years ago. These problems help to define our common African identity. During these periods, some other uneven political issues were on, which totally confused the nation. I would hear in the street every day, most of the citizens blaming the government for poor leadership. However, the main reason was due to the growth of the country-wide electricity demand. The ISCOM company's megawatt was not responding to the demand. They introduced load shedding or load reduction in the countries for a short period. This was done to improve the country electrical systems, in order to meet the demand. ESCOM substantiated new power capacity and improved their older power stations and infrastructure. This led the company to satisfy their customer services at the end of 2015. Through my experience, I believe some of the blame from citizens were right. However, not all endeavors were wrong. As from 2015 to 2018, many other complaints are ongoing in RSA, against the government. I reckon in my life that complaints do not benefit any nations, it only confuses and affects the growth of African countries. African opposition and leading parties' leaders need to learn how to solve problems without fighting or discrimination on each other to take African countries forward, because in my youth, before the civil war in the Republic of Congo in 1997, everything was perfect. Each child was eating 4 square meals a day. We had electricity, and we lived together with our neighbors without any trouble. After the Civil War, things changed in many homes, with some children eating only 1 meal a day and the electricity supply was intermittent. Ethnic and political conflicts were at the root of civil wars, causing neighbors to kill one another and engaging in blaming and complaining about political leadership failure. After failing to solve our problem verbally or wisely, our leaders choose the way of violence. This destroyed the Congolian happiness that we had before the Civil War, as well as the country's infrastructure. South Africa is a nation of ethnicities and different colored citizens. Surely this delicate balance, which was caused during these periods of load shedding and other political issues that are ongoing until today, 2018, can be easily disturbed. Especially if there are not mindful and well-crafted systems to develop mindsets that work against these divisive ways of thinking. Today, when some of the Africans are confronted with any problems, the first reaction taken by them is the blame and complain, directed against other people or their leaders, instead of looking for solutions. However, these dissatisfactions sometimes have led to destruction, civil wars, fights, strikes, confusions and divisions, etc. These destructions are always solved after some disasters, and we start to look for the solutions, mainly outside the continent. This is continuing to limit our level of thinking and has become our default mind. To date, across the globe, it is difficult for many young people to get any type of job, and this is even truer of Africans. Unproductive youths, who are not educated with critical mindsets, are more susceptible to the control of misguided leaders. They are more easily persuaded by those leaders who motivate them to strike and destroy the ongoing prosperity or economy of their countries. On the other hand, they pick up weapons given to them and get absorbed into criminal gang groups, ethnic or color conflict. They then go out and kill their brothers and sisters who might belong to a different ethnic group or gang groups. I say, when we do not have anything productive to do, we are more easily persuaded to go out and kill or hurt each other. Sometimes other political opposition parties use these opportunities to tarnish the current leadership. In other countries, they create a rebellion or raise citizens against the leading party when things are going wrong, instead of bringing solutions. We create more trouble by blaming or attacking the leaders in power. The result is almost complete destruction, whilst those provocative leaders sit with their families in relative safety. Mostly African youth go out and kill each other or end up in prison after they failed to control their mindset. In this particular case, Section 1 of this book becomes very helpful to learn much about how to control our mindset, not to be driven by wrong leaders. If all African people, primarily the youth among others, do not learn how to keep themselves busy, united and productive, African leaders will not be able to transform or change the African continent faster. We will remain in our dreams, complaining and blaming our leaders every day. Africans have to start looking out of the box and start equipping ourselves so that we can improve and develop the continent rapidly towards changing the living conditions of our families. There is still much work to be done by leadership and community, starting first with leveling the mindset or the thinking of African people. Eventually, we can achieve more. For example, today if we look at how the African economy affects the growth of the continent, we find it in through many reasons. One of them being because we do not have much control over our own economies due to unproductive youth. Take, for instance, since 2014 Nigeria has always been referred to as the giant of Africa, both in terms of the economy and population. To date, in 2018 it's still among the top list of the richest African countries in terms of the gross domestic product, GDP. This is due to its vast reserves of oil and gas, as the biggest oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa. In 2014, Nigeria's currency, naira, topped over the South Africa rand, as the largest African economy. This was successfully due to the rapid growth of their GDP, with the help of the non-oil sectors, such as telecommunications, banking, entertainment, hotel, tourism and informal sectors. At the beginning of the 3 months of 2015, the outlook for Nigeria's economic growth slowed down, due to the instability of the world oil price. The Nigeria government managed to stabilize their economy at the end of 2015, with the help of non-oil sectors, especially agriculture and services, among others. In 2016 again, the GDP growth dropped down to -1.5%, and in 2017, it recovered about 2.2%. However, today the vast economy of Nigerian income still depends on its oil and gas. This shows Africa that if the expert masters who control the factors of production, oil rig specialists, chemists and petroleum experts, would stop working or leave the Nigeria petrol zone. Furthermore, if some of the customers slow their purchasing of Nigeria petrol, the Nigerian economy will fail in significant ways, leading to destabilization and job losses in the country. The potential is high for Nigerian youth who might resort to some form of crime and destruction in strikes. Unless the government intervenes through initiatives, like their current non-oil sector continuing to develop faster to control a high percentage of the economy. This is not only true for Nigeria but for all African countries. Another example is the Republic of Congo-Brazzaville. Its economic growth was 6% in 2014. Growth fell back to 1.2% in 2015 because of the world price of oil. In 2016, the stability of oil prices led the GDP growth to increase to about 4.2%, and at the end of 2017 rose with an estimate of about 4.7%. In between 2014 to 2017, the drop in oil prices weakened the country's economic prospects. This led the country to the centralized economic structure to result in weak spatial inclusion, despite advances due to recent investments in infrastructure. However, there are instances of some African people talking about the Europeans and Americans as responsible for bribery or exploitation of oil and other minerals from the African countries. In fact, the African people have few highly trained specialist engineers and doctors within the industries who can control and design the oil rigs. This includes the majority of Africans' manufacturing sectors and other minerals. Without Europeans, Asian and American expertise, unless Africans can improve their skills so that the Western countries' specialists could be controlled when they exploit the continent minerals and oil, the local experts would provide the services they offer and the country could avoid the exploitation. It happens when foreign experts are responsible for running a vital aspect of an African country's economy. This is to stop the bribery of African petroleum and other minerals. I personally prefer having Europeans, Asians and Americans render their services because they provide our African families with jobs. At least, until the African people can upgrade themselves in a big manner and develop their mindset highly through education, like Chinese development in the past years. By training more African youth with critical thinking and innovate systems or technologies, this will continue to improve much faster the African people's lives. This will also allow the African intelligence or technologist leaders to oppose some of the corrupt Western leadership or systems. The Chinese leadership did so in the period of the 20th to the 21st centuries to gain their authority in the world technology, which is what the African youth inventions are aiming at. To date, the majority of the African countries' economies are not controlled by African leaders and people. For example, despite South Africa being one of the most sophisticated economies in Africa, it's in the delicate balance as things can change at any moment. To clarify this, the last 3 years, From September 2015 to February 2018, I worked for one of the boat manufacturing companies, as a mechanical fitter, which has approximately about 1,500 employees. In 2017, the company is owned by one American and other shareholders. The customers who buy the boats are largely out of the continent. This is one of the reasons why African economies are not controlled by ourselves. Over 50% of African people's jobs depend on the owner's or boss's effort coming from another continent. This is continuing to lead us to depend upon the authority of some Western leaders. They have total control and take decisions for African countries about the type of leadership they want to see on the continent. An example is, if some of the Western leaders decide to do anything in South Africa that does not benefit South African citizens, and the president refuses, these leaders have the power to influence the South African people to unseat their president, literally. This is because of the lack of mindset development within some African people. The African economic system, by being controlled by some Western leaders, has caused many African leaders to be seen as failures or as running their countries without their own ideologies. In this case, they could ask the company owners to move it overseas, on many occasions, if the leaders refused to comply. Depending on how much income the company is generating for South Africa through tax, that will affect the country's economy. If the company owners decide to move the company out of South Africa, citing the case of my former employee, the result would be about over 1,000 jobless South Africans. They will blame the government for their loss of income. Some workers may not believe that the president was trying to protect them in the long term, nor would the next generation of citizens believe. Instead of now looking at other opportunities, some may resort to crime and prostitution, among other ills. Unless an initiative like African Youth Inventions and other critical mindset programs can step in and work on their mindset through motivation, support, inspiration and training opportunities. This is an example of only one company. There are many other companies that are not owned by Africans, with a foreign customer base, and all these companies might be vulnerable to the same pressures. As Africans, we have to work hard and think fast to come up with many solutions. These will allow us to control a high percentage of our economies. Imagine how many jobs could be created for Kenyan people, if today, the African Union leaders could agree to consume about 70% of the coffee produced from Kenya. They could use one country such as Burundi to build thousands of industries that will produce some type of nutrition such as any specific fruits and sweets, among other products, which will be consumed in all African countries. This approach to growing and consume African products, like cocoa, would provide more jobs to countries like Côte d'Ivoire. We will never be able to create more jobs in Africa if we remain consumers of many products grown and processed outside the continent. For example, as an African businessman, I will never be able to create jobs for Africans if my fellow people remain as consumers of outside the continent products and services similar to my offer. We should be using our own systems to establish businesses to continue to build and develop the economies in all African countries that will be supplied by, and use products made within the continent. This approach could be extended to any type of industries, as each country has their local operational government system and services that allow them to create more jobs for the citizens. Although we have productive lands, water, minerals and the highest young generation, we are still struggling. Clearly, we need more youth initiatives such as the African Youth Inventions Initiative, as well as to promote other existing organizations. These are currently dealing with African people issues to develop systems that will allow us to boost job creation on the continent. Another example, the Northern African countries may be focusing on specific types of businesses related to the products suitable to their particular environments. They could supply the rest of the countries, and the southern countries may focus on other types of businesses to supply the entire continent. The same may be happening for Eastern and Western Africa. Perhaps the central countries could be used for transactions and transportation systems. In that way, we may control our economy as a mechanism for uniting Africa, by balancing the systems in the whole continent. This is another reason why the AYI shows, debates will focus on issues that affect the African continent. It's aiming to spread the debate across the continent, like other current African shows aims, while African leaders engage to bring change, leading to total control and transformation of the continent's economy. One of the visions of AYI is to use the ordinary African ideas to augment the transformation of the continent. For example, the Made in Africa brand could be expanded to any industry. This includes the marketing of these products grown and produced locally. Many of the African countries' television, media and radio stations generally focus on advertising their own local brands and public figures as well as Western ones. I believe this could also be one of the mistakes on the continent. If we have to boost African economies, we would need to expand and promote more African brands and public figures in all African countries' media systems, as some few media in the continent have started. For example, if one of the Western singers intends to perform a concert in Zambia, Angola or any other country, his tickets will be sold out, and this will boost the Western economy because he pays tax in their continent. If it is one of our African artists, far fewer tickets will be sold because African people are less familiar with the music from other African countries. To clarify this, when I came to South Africa for the first time, in 2006, I listened to the Southern Africa music called house music. I rarely heard such music from the Congo-Brazzaville media. Why so? Because most of the Africans are not exposed to some other continental music. This is a failure by Africans to promote local artists, businessmen, talents and music, among others, across the continent. This limits their exposure as a brand, and this lack of support affects not only the individual success of the artist in question but also the economies in which they perform and live.
Promoting Africa and the African talent will offer opportunities for talent growth in the continent. This also plays a role in developing the country's economies. As today, in 2018, we can see many African national teams of football are coached by Europeans. This is because the majority of African leaders believe that the local coach will never win the World Cup. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, in 2018, none of the African teams coached by Europeans played the World Cup final. This shows that the level of our thinking needs development. By not accepting our failure and learning to fix things by stopping the blaming, like the Chinese improve their visions, as discussed more in Section 4, of Volume 2 of 2. When some of the local coaches are given opportunities and make a mistake, they lose their job. However, when the Europeans make mistakes, we understand them. In the same way, when an African president makes mistakes, we fight them or take them to the International Court of Justice. At the same time, when Western leaders make mistakes such as continuing to support our leaders with weapons that killed our families, we understand and praise them. I believe as Africans, confusion has taken from us a part of our own conscience. Another example, there are many young businessmen in the continent who are struggling to win their national or the 55 African countries' clientele, which has been seduced by foreign brands. Imagine if the whole continent supports our young initiative, many jobs will be created in Africa. There are many African entrepreneurs' inspirational stories. Therefore, AYI is aiming to publish about the initiatives in its social media, a magazine, a newspaper and website discussion pages. We will be looking forward to continuing to publish them to inspire Africans. We need to stop confusing ourselves by focusing more on the outside of the continent. We have talented youth who are eager to learn and develop our continent. All they need is the inspiration, support and motivation. By training African teenagers through skills and mindset development, it is going to benefit them to grow up with a positive and productive mindset. We need to initiate some other training systems that we never had, as one of the new courses developed by AYI called MST courses, starting in 2018. The courses are divided under levels of ages and focus on skills and mindset development to stimulate Africans into more productiveness. The new courses, in the future, are beneficial guidance to avoid people behaving immaturely. This will assist our youth to communicate professionally and solve problems. The world histories prove that not all people who have made a big impact in the world have attained higher educational qualifications. However, they were mentally cultivated. They never gave up or let other people deactivate their mindset. They will learn to believe in themselves and keep the faith that anything is possible. They will learn too how to be focused on their dreams and achieve them. They are also going to learn how to work hard and passionately bring change, regardless of the obstacles and failures they will have encountered. They will persevere and fight their way through. These are examples of ideologies that African leaders may continue to apply to all children to educate them mentally, as early as primary school level, to change Africa. It needs not only to be about skills building, infrastructure or government grants, but also about mindset development. Apparently, most African leaders are academically educated and skillful. At the same time, they still struggle to maintain the growth and the control of some radical Africans affected through negative minds. This allows the Western leaders to continue maintaining the control of African economies. However, we first need to build strong mentalities of all Africans at an early age to create a positive attitude. By inspiring our youth to understand that anything is possible if they work hard, stay positive and be dedicated to their dreams. If they wish to become doctors or any professional, they may start by visualizing their dream from an early age. An important element of this visualization is not to limit yourself. As I always say, any doctor has more experience than me, but they should not place constraints on my dream. My freedom to find solutions based on my determination and critical engagement with a problem should be the yardstick for my own dream. This will allow you to do things better than any person that you ever thought as better than you. To date, some African youths may think that Western countries' youths are far smarter than them. This is not true. Bear this in your mind, African youth, that in this world, a human being's ability to think and solve problems has nothing to do with color or continent of origin or the level of their qualification. The difference lies in the opportunities available. Historically, African youths have largely been disturbed and traumatized in their environment, through religions, politics, wars and ethnic group conflicts. Their counterparts from other continents are being educated and introduced to advanced technology and critical mind thinking. Today, in the 21st century, most of the important inventions come from outside the African continent. From this, it would seem like Africans are incompetent in some way, so we need to strongly encourage all African youth of all races to believe that they can make a huge impact and make positive changes in this world. One of the giants of the African continent is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who fought for the African independence and spirited the fight for freedom in the African continent. He never had enough money to pay for tuition fees at the University of Lincoln, in the USA, where he got the extra knowledge to bring his dream to life. However, he believed and brought his dream to life by taking a risk, as discussed below under his biography. With his positive mindset, he achieved his dream and succeeded in liberating Ghana from colonization, in 1957. Through his positive mindset, the rest of the African countries' leaders, and others who were fighting before and after him stood up. Eventually, around the 1960s, the majority of the African countries were freed from colonization. This shows us that your thoughts, positive mindset and stories of success can inspire others. You can succeed in whatever situation that is impeding your dream. You need to continue to work hard every day to find better solutions and leave behind the doubts and feelings of inferiority imposed on you that control you and do not permit you to achieve your own dreams. As Africans, equipping young Africans with wisdom and skills, starting from primary school level, will be a great advantage in giving Africa direction. We are focusing too much on the Western educational systems. These limit our youth into thinking and working less on their own dreams. These systems of development inherited through colonization, by some Western leaders who wanted to dominate and control the whole world, became a barrier to a new critical mindset. This continues to hold some of our African families, who are still slavering from their own mindset. It has continued to destroy us because they have been planted in the mindset of the majority of African people. This position is exacerbated by some of the African leaders who behave in the same way as the rulers of the DTCTC systems. This has the effect of running their countries according to the similar policies which divide different ethnic groups. Therein, they rule us with lies, to control us in terms of their own interests and agendas. The only way to stop poverty, crime, wars, negativity, and xenophobia in Africa is to improve the African education system by training a new generation with a modern mentality. The leaders of the DTCTC system come as though they are bearing gifts. However, the truth is, it is one of the subtle persuasions of promoting propaganda, which persuade us to be controlled. This is a result of acting against the interests of our mind control masters, instead of our own interests, which has left us divided and suffering. We cannot totally stop these manipulations within our current generation. It will take time, but we will finish the striving to change things for future generations by improving educational systems. Our aim is to give a chance to most African kids to understand that, to be happy in life is not only about having more money or being born into rich families. However, it is primarily about learning to control your own mindset. I believe that with this kind of orientation, African youth will be a strong generation. This will not let us fall into the same trap and let the young become confused, but instead, will take Africa to the next level of being an independent, economically advanced continent. African countries. Africa has 54 countries, with a fully recognized state status, as in 2018. They are all members of the United Nations, including 2 kingdoms, Lesotho and Swaziland, and 4 islands, Comoros, Madagascar, Mauritius and Seychelles. There are 55 countries as members of the African Union. There are 2 states, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and the Republic of Somaliland, that established themselves in Africa as sovereign states but not recognized as members of the United Nations. The Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic is a member of the African Union. Lastly, there are other non-sovereign territories currently located around Africa as discussed below. As of the year 2018, the largest population is in Nigeria, with a projection of 182 million in 2017, as reported by the National Population Commission, NPC, of Nigeria. The 55 African countries are 1. Algeria, 2. Angola, 3. Benin, 4. Botswana, 5. Burkina Faso, 6. Burundi, 7. Cabo Verde, 8. Cameroon, 9. Central African Republic, CAR, 10. Chad, 11. Comoros, 12. Democratic Republic of the Congo, 13. Republic of the Congo, 14. Côte d'Ivoire, 15. Djibouti, 16. Egypt, 17. Equatorial Guinea, 18. Eritrea, 19. Ethiopia, 20. Gabon, 21. Gambia, 22. Ghana, 23. Guinea, 24. Guinea-Bissau, 25. Kenya, 26. Lesotho, 27. Liberia, 28. Libya, 29. Madagascar, 30. Malawi, 31. Mali, 32. Mauritania, 33. Mauritius, 34. Morocco, 35. Mozambique, 36. Namibia, 37. Niger, 38. Nigeria, 39. Rwanda, 40. Sao Tome and Principe, 41. Senegal, 42. Seychelles, 43. Sierra Leone, 44. Somalia, 45. South Africa, 46. South Sudan, 47. Sudan, 48. Swaziland, 49. Tanzania, 50. Togo, 51. Tunisia, 52. Uganda, 53. Zambia, 54. Zimbabwe, and 55, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic as member of African Union. The other non-sovereign territories located around Africa are 1. French Southern and Antarctic lands, a group of volcanic islands, 2. Reunion, 3. Mayotte. All these three groups of islands are located in the southern Africa Indian Ocean. 4. Canary Islands, 5. Ceuta, 6. Melilla, 7. Madeira. All these four groups of islands are located in northwestern Africa Atlantic Ocean. 8. Pelagi. This island is located in the northern Africa Mediterranean Sea. 9. St. Helena, located in the southern Africa Atlantic Ocean. The statistics for each of the 55 countries in Africa are discussed more in Section 5, Volume 2 of this book. Many events, good and bad, have happened in these countries and continue occurring, with the majority of African youths living in these countries still struggling. They do not have many resources to prepare for their future, compared to other continental youths. Most of the Western countries' youth are often sponsored with advanced technology in their schools by the respective governments, a thing lacking in Africa. Meanwhile, some radical, political, traditional and religious leaders in Africa are also confusing these youth, which continues to let the majority of them down. Some youths have even died with ideas that might have solved many of the issues facing Africa and the world. Another aim of is to focus on multidisciplinary research and work towards discovering the talents and promoting the conditions that could lead to the introduction of research laboratories to create more solutions. The more we support youth talents in the continent, the more they would provide more inventions. This could play a role in creating extra opportunities and offering other solutions for the globe, in general, and Africa, in particular. To date, some Africans are making some difference on the continent. African people's fight. The fight of African people was started by many African heroes. Some have made a difference, and others have died without completing their dreams due to the misleading of the African mindset. Among these heroes, 6 have been selected for this book. These inspired the author to start writing and founded the AYI company. This book is written to motivate African people, who are confused due to some frustrating conditions, and to encourage them that life is a fight. We still have big fights to finish within our continent, firstly, against our own mindset, and secondly to fight with non-violence, the DTCTC system, against the masters and some corrupt leaders of Africa. For several years since the independence of African countries, many of our African families are dying like animals and some lacking food and peace of mind. The international organizations, such as the United Nations, UN, and even the African Union, AU, haven't yet taken the best corrective action to end these barbaric acts perpetrated in the names of some corrupt leadership. This leaves the vast majority of Africans as helpless victims to these leaders who act in cohorts with some Western leaders' support. It is only after when many people have died, in barbaric slaughter or ethnic cleansing has taken place, that solutions are offered. This is done, almost always in the form of weapons sold to leaders to help protect the at-risk populations. This does benefit more the economies of the countries producing the weapons than for the suffering victims. This has led some of the Western leadership to maintain their control over African economies. The 6 heroes selected are Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana; Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya; Emery Patrice Lumumba, the Democratic Republic of the Congo; Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso; Muammar al-Gaddafi, Libya; and Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, South Africa. To understand the fight of these 6 heroes, it is important to remember that some of these struggles are ongoing. It could be seen within the context of colonization in Africa and the struggles during the independence and post-independence within the continent. The following is a list of the Western colonizers to Africa. The Portuguese Empire in Africa were the earliest Europeans to explore the continent and the longest-lived of the colonial empires that started in the 15th centuries. This was strongly achieved by the third son of the Portugal monarch, King John I of Portugal, commonly known as Prince Henry, the Navigator. Since the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the religious conflict between the Arab and Europeans, Muslims and Christians, caused several wars between them, in which the Muslims were in control of most of the North African areas and the Middle East. In the 11th century, the Crusades, Christians' campaigns to fight for the religion's holy places invaded by a Muslim, started a war against the Muslim. In the 13th century, southern Portugal was also influenced by the Islamic faith. In the following centuries, in between the 13th to the 15th century, the Portuguese fought some wars along the Morocco and Europe borders with the dominant Muslims. At the same time, the entire African countries around the Mediterranean Sea, Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, and Libya, as well as the majority of Middle East countries, were under the control of the Muslims, mostly the Arabs. The influence of Arab control in the Mediterranean Sea impeded the Europeans' trade directly with some powerful Asian regions, like Japan, India, and China states, among others. In 1415, the Portuguese invaded the Ceuta, an African land territory, located on the north coast of Africa, around the Mediterranean Sea, sharing a western border with Morocco. Today, Ceuta is a Spanish autonomous city, since 1995. This successful attack, in 1415, inspired Prince Henry's ideology of exploring the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The main aim was to find out the limit of Muslim territories and develop the trade between Europeans and Asians. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Portuguese sailed the Atlantic Ocean patiently, in an attempt to discover if they could go around the continent. They discovered many African kingdoms along the Atlantic coast and Indian Oceans. They were interested in trade within African areas, in order to export gold, ivory and pepper, among other products. Later, by avoiding the Arab and Ottoman Empire domination, based along the Indian Ocean coast, they brought with them several Christian priests, through whom they introduced Christianity in some African kingdoms. The first group of Portuguese explorers that sailed the long distance of the Atlantic Ocean was led by Bartholomew Dias. They managed to reach the Cape of Good Hope, commonly called Cape Point, found in South Africa, in 1488. He was followed by Vasco da Gama's group, which achieved to go around Africa. Afterwards, Vasco explored the coast of the Indian Ocean and created the shipping route, from the European coast of the Atlantic Ocean to the Asian coast of the Indian Ocean, passing via Cape Point, referred to as the Cape Sea Route or the Cape Route. In the following years, other Portuguese explored the African lands. In the same period of the 15th century, the Spanish also joined the movement of the Portuguese. The focus was on the American areas. Later, they both signed the agreement of the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 to avoid conflict and to define each other's spheres of influence. In the mid-15th century, the Portuguese developed their trade with Spain, African kingdoms and other Europeans, as well as started the slavery business. In the 16th to 18th centuries, while the Portuguese explored Africa, other European countries, England, Dutch, and France, among others, joined the Cape Sea Route, until the 19th century, when the colonization era started. The Portuguese managed to colonize 5 African countries. In the 20th century, the colonizations came to an end. They freed their colonies, with the last one being in 1975. November 1975, Angola. Today, all the five countries plus Equatorial Guinea, which was colonized by Spain, mainly speak Portuguese as their business language. The British Empire in Africa began under England's merchants at the end of the 16th century. After that, the English fleet defeated the Spanish Armada, La Grande y Felicissima Armada or Great and Most Fortunate Fleet, the Spanish Navy, in 1588, which wanted to invade England's territory. Queen Elizabeth I permitted the London merchants to start sailing the Indian Ocean in 1591. Afterwards, from 1591 to 1600, several England ships sailed the Cape Sea Route, with one of the remarkable ships called Edward Bonaventure. Then, in 1600 the East India Company, EIC, was founded. It started to trade along the Cape Route, along with the Portuguese, in the Indian Ocean. In 1707, under the Acts of Union 1707, the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England, include Kingdom of Wales, created a single United Kingdom, UK, or the Kingdom of Great Britain that took over the whole of the island of Great Britain and the many islands around it. In 1801, under an Act of Union 1800, the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland joined into one, the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. In between the 16th to the 19th century, some Welsh, English, Scottish and the Irish explored African areas. In the following centuries, all these areas became the colonies of the British Empire or the UK, in the 19th century, which count 19 African countries. In the 20th century, the colonization came to an end, and they freed their colonies, with the last one being in 1980, April 1980, Zimbabwe. Today all 19 countries plus St. Helena Island and one side of Cameroon speak English, mainly as their business language. In addition, one of the African island territories remains as a UK overseas department, namely, St. Helena. The Netherlands was one of the provinces of the Spanish Empire for many years, after the rise of Martin Luther in the 16th century, with his ideology of protesting against the Catholic Church rules. Later, the Dutch Revolt, 1559 to 1648, started in the 16th century, against the rules of the Roman Catholic, and other political issues during the reign of King Philip II of Spain. These tensions led to the formation of the independent provinces, which were centralized with political power to the monarchy of Spain. 7 of the northern provinces broke away from Habsburg Spain and formed the Dutch Republic, led by William of Orange. Later, the Dutch Republic developed much, financially and in navy technology. They started to sail the Cape Sea route at the end of the 16th century. They were competing with other Europeans within the Cape Route in 1602. Various Dutch companies united to create the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, VOC. The company is also known as United East India or Dutch East India Company. The company was created with the express intention of competing against the Portuguese domination in trade and the England, EIC, Company, via the Cape Sea route. This led to the seat of Dutch in Africa, particularly in the southern Africa countries. They started the Cape Colony in the 17th century, 1652. Later, a larger number of Dutch families came to establish themselves in the Cape Colony, for farming activities. Afterwards, the conflict between England and the Dutch caused the majority of Dutch farmers, called Boer, to move away from the Cape Colony and they invaded some other southern African areas. Today, these Dutch families are classified under one of the African ethnic groups, called Afrikaners. In the 18th century, their populations were growing faster along southern Africa. In the 19th century, the Boer families established different republics in the southern African areas, referred to as the Boer republics, also called Boer states. They also developed one of the African languages spoken in southern Africa countries, called Afrikaans. In 1910 the Dutch and Britain colony areas signed a Union of South Africa. This included the majority of all southern African kingdoms' territories as part of it. This made the Union of South Africa another power country, as a colony, over other African territories in the 20th century. The Union government was led by Dutch-born Africans. Before the formulation of the Republic of South Africa, in 1948, the South African government started segregation and discrimination, apartheid, against black people. In 1961, the British freed South African areas, and South Africa became the Republic of South Africa. Meanwhile, the Union of South Africa lasted until 1969. However, South Africa was still led by African whites, Afrikaners or Boers. They maintained apartheid in the southern African areas, which officially ended in between 1990 to 1994, 1990 in Namibia and 1994 in South Africa. Today, The Dutch families are the majority of white African nationalities in the southern African countries. In addition, the two African countries controlled by the Dutch for a long period, Namibia and South Africa, speak mainly English and Afrikaans, among other dominant African languages as their business languages. The French Empire began in Africa in the 17th century. In between the 14th to the 15th centuries, the French monarchy was in an unstable state. At the end of about 100 Years' War, lasted from 1337 to 1453, against England. Later, the monarchy continued to oppose the Spain Empire, to ensure their independence from Spain and papal influences. During the reign of King Francis I, 1515 to 1547 CE, the king was interested in the New World and initiated the French Renaissance. He attracted many Italian artists to work in the France Kingdom. Along the years of the 16th century, France developed their naval supremacy and got involved in the world exploration. By the 1620s, the French started to establish trading posts along the western coast of Africa, along with the Portuguese. In 1638, they established a trading station in Senegal. In 1664, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Minister of Finance, founded French East India and the French West India Companies to compete against other European companies for trading in the Cape Sea route. Later, in 1673, a Senegal company, French Compagnie du Sénégal, was founded, which got involved more in the slave trade. This led to the presence of several French explorers in the continent, in between the 17th to the 18th century. One of these explorers, Italian-born French, named Pierre Sauvignon de Bratza, explored and conserved much territory in the history of French colonization. The French started the colonization in the 19th century and colonized 20 African countries for a long period. In the 20th century, the colonization came to an end. They freed their colonies, mostly in 1960, with the last one being in 1977, June 1977, Djibouti. Today, all 20 countries plus another seven African countries and islands speak mainly French as their business language. In addition, two of the African island territories remain as French overseas departments, namely, Réunion and Mayotte. The Germans' empire started to explore Africa in the 17th century, after the rise of Martin Luther's philosophy of protesting against the Catholic Church. The religion wars started and caused many divisions within European civilization. During this period, Brandenburg is one of the modern federated states of Germany, was part of Habsburg monarchy. Frederick William was a member of the House of Hohenzollern, and he is mostly referred to as the Elector of Brandenburg from 1640, until his death in 1688. He was involved in several wars against the influence of the Habsburg leadership and other kingdoms over the territory of Germany. He developed the Brandenburg economic policy and got involved in the world trade. His leadership led to the presence of German explorers in Africa, which continued to be supported by his successor sons. In 1681, he orders the first Brandenburger Navy to West Africa. Following the Brandenburger African Company was established to trade in West Africa. After years, the name Brandenburger African Company was changed to Prussian African Company, which was trading in the Cape Sea route. The company was based in the Gold Coast colony, now Ghana, until 1717, when Frederick William I sold the company to the Dutch Republic. In between the 17th to the 19th century, many other Germans explored African areas as traders, which later fell under the control of Germany. During the scramble for Africa and after the Berlin Conference, 1884–85, the German Empire started to gain control over some areas in Africa. They gained control of some of the areas which were not dominated by other Europeans, such as in the case of Tanzania territories. They used force to occupy some areas of Tanzania which were controlled by some Arabs. In the early 20th century, they colonized what is now Cameroon, Togo, Tanzania, Tanganyika areas, Rwanda, Burundi, and Namibia. During the period of World War I, 1914 to 1918, they lost control of these colonies, which were seized by its enemies, mainly the British and French empires, as well as Belgium. This caused the Germans to fail to colonize any African country for a long period after they lost the total control of these colonies in 1919. The Spanish Empire came to establish itself more in Africa, officially in the 18th century. Starting in the 15th century, the Spanish Empire was focused on exploring the American areas. Meanwhile, the Portuguese based in Africa when they started trading together. The first Spanish that sailed the Atlantic Ocean and reached America in 1492 was Christopher Columbus. In the 1520s, Spanish explorers sailed the Pacific Ocean and reached Asia. In the following centuries, the Portuguese explorers started to penetrate the South America areas. This led them into a conflict with the Spanish for not respecting the First Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. The first treaty was signed to limit the areas of both empires, Spain to explore America and Portugal to Africa. To end the new conflict, Spain and Portugal came to a conclusion of signing a Treaty of El Pardo in 1778, in exchange for one area within the America territories. One of the areas, to Brazil's west, along with the line established by the First Treaty of Tordesillas, was given to the Portuguese. The African islands of Annobon and Fernando-Poo, now Bioko, and the Guinea coast, between the Niger River along the Nigeria coast and the Ogu River in the Gabon coast, were given to the Spanish Empire. This treaty established the seat of the Spanish in African areas, and they started their colony in the 19th century. They colonized only one African country, called Equatorial Guinea. In the 20th century, the colonizations came to an end. Spain freed Equatorial Guinea in October 1968, and today Equatorial Guinea is the only African country that speaks mainly Spanish as their business language. The Belgian colonial empire started to explore Africa in the 19th century. In the early 19th century, Belgium was part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, until 1831 when the Belgian kingdom started separately with the first king, Leopold I. After his death in 1865, the reign of Leopold II started. In 1876, the new king organized his private company, and in 1818, he hired a Welsh famous explorer, Henry Stanley. He explored Africa and established the Congo colony, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo DRC. His philosophy of colonization led other Europeans to start the scramble for Africa. After the Berlin Conference took place, which recognized his areas to which he and Stanley had claimed as his colony. On the 5th of February 1885, the Congo Free State was established under Leopold II's personal authority army. This led other Europeans to claim some other African areas as their colonies. In 1908, the Belgian government took over the colony of Congo, after many complaints from other Europeans of the major scandal of the Congolese, under the king's private government. This led other Belgian explorers into Africa, after the World War I, 1914 in 1918. They also took control of the other two modern countries, namely Burundi and Rwanda, which were controlled by Germany before. They started the colonies in the 19th century, in 3 African countries. At the end of colonization in the 20th century, they freed all the 3 countries, with the last 2 in July 1962, Burundi and Rwanda. The United States of America, USA, started to establish their force in Africa in the 19th century. Before, the Europeans started the slave trade in the mid-15th century and ended in the 19th century. Millions of African people were exported to American areas. These Africans gave birth to several generations. In 1816 the American Colonization Society, ACS, was established by Robert Finally, with a vision to take some African Americans to their homeland, Africa. Later, the ACS supported the migration of any free African Americans to the continent of Africa. This helped the USA to start the colony of Liberia in 1821-22, on the coast of West Africa, referred to as the Free African American. This led the American authority to control the area and get involved as traders in other African countries which were colonized by other European countries. In the 19th century, they freed Liberia since 1847 under Liberian leadership and continued to play a major role as a trader in other African countries during the colonization period and after the African independence days. The Italians explored Africa, mainly in the 19th century. The empire struggled to gain control over some African areas, while other Europeans were dominant in the majority of the areas. In 1838, an Italian businessman Rabattino Raffaele founded his own shipping company that operated around Italy's coast. Later, the company started trading in East Africa, in the Eritrean Sea, now Red Sea, along with Africans and Arabs. In the same period, a non-profit Italian geographical society, Società Geografica Italiana (SGI), was founded in 1967, with the main goal of innovating knowledge and also development geographically. In 1869, the Rabattino Shipping Company of Italy purchased the town of Assab, a port city in the southern Red Sea region of Eritrea, from the local sultans, and it became part of the Italian government. During these periods, these companies were supported by the Italian government, and this led many Italian explorers into Africa, while some were present before, but not under the Italian Empire command. Later, in the 20th century, the Italian Empire colonized Libya and some Horn of Africa areas, such as Somalia's areas. They also attempted to control Ethiopia for a short period. During World War I, Italy became an enemy of the British authority. The British supported the Ethiopian kingdom to get rid of the Italian presence in Ethiopia, while other Horn of Africa areas controlled by Italians were taken over by the British government, as new colonies. This conflict left Italians with only one colony of Libya, which was later decolonized again, in December 1951. Today, Libya is the unique country in Africa that speaks Italian slightly, in the countryside. However, Arabic is their main business language. South Africa, on the 31st of May 1910, the British colony of South African areas and Afrikaners, a group of white people descended from predominantly Dutch colony areas, formulated the Union of South Africa. Together they colonized some other African areas in the 20th century. In the case of Namibia, after the Germans lost control of Namibia in 1915, World War I, the Union of South Africa Authority took control of Namibia. In 1961 the British granted independence of South Africa and the Republic of South Africa was established. Before the Republic, the South Africa government led by the Afrikaners started apartheid, segregation and discrimination, since 1948. After the formulation of the Republic of South Africa, the apartheid government continued to rule both South African and Namibia citizens under apartheid constitutions. Furthermore, this same government evolved into the control over other areas and attempted to expand their authority to invade some of Angola's territories, after the Portuguese government freed Angola. They supported one of Angola's rebellion party, called the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. Later, they had been defeated by the Angolan army, with the massive support of Cuba and Russia's military, who fought for Angola's freedom. Following phase, the ANC SWAPO, Cubans, the Angolans and the Soviets armies together with other support from African nations, were preparing to overthrow the apartheid government in South Africa. This forced the apartheid government of South Africa to negotiate with SWAPO and ANC for Namibia independence and South African citizens' freedom respectively. In the same period, the independence of Namibia was granted in 1990. In the following years, after the pressure of some of the international community and African nations, including some of the South African political parties, the apartheid government came to an end in 1994, and the freedom of black South Africans was attained. Egypt, after gaining their independence from Britain on February 28, 1922, the country associated with Britain again. Together they colonized Sudan, which started from 1899 to 1956. On January 1, 1956, Sudan gained its independence from Egypt and British authorities. Afterwards, the Southern Sudan Area Authority protested against the independent Sudan government and became the Republic of South Sudan, on the 9th of July 2011. Ethiopia is the only African country that has never been colonized by Europeans. Eritrea was one of the provinces of Ethiopia. In the 21st century, the Eritrean Province Authority came to protest against the Ethiopian government. They gained their independence on May 24, 1993, as the Republic of Eritrea. The Europeans managed to divide Africa. Before the Age of Exploration, a period between the 15th centuries to the 18th centuries, several things were developed by Africans, in technologies and some inventions, especially within ancient Egypt and other parts of Africa, discussed more in Volume 2 of this book. However, the early Africans failed to write histories and distribute their knowledge widely to African generations. At the same time, they transferred their knowledge orally, while the Europeans' close relationship with some African areas promoted through the history of Europe a legacy of some of this knowledge. The Europeans used their technologies and some of the African knowledge and developed their modern Western countries' technologies. Eventually, they could build their empires and use some of these technologies and come back to Africa for exploring. The Europeans promoted the slave trade. Later they invaded and colonized Africa lands. They brought with them the philosophy of controlling people's minds and planned many systems. These systems helped create confusion among some African leaders and their people. This has been used to control the entire continent. The majority of African leaders understood the ideologies of some of these Western leaders' philosophies of controlling and dominating the world. Some have tried to contest these ideologies, others continue to use it as an opportunity for their own interests. Today the DTCTC system has dominated the mindset of some other radical leaders. Some of these corrupt African leaders continue to support the Western philosophies to maintain their posts for long tenures, like kings. These negative thoughts had dominated their mindset, which led them to think of themselves as, in some ways, inferior to the technologies of advanced countries from the West. They then found themselves disbelieving their dreams and failing in their drive to solve the problems of African countries. They are found to be rich in talking and poor in action. As is the case in the present day, in 2018, the majority of African leaders are running to China for help, for technologies. However, some of them are still taking long to promote much and challenge their youths in critical mind thinking, to bring the norm technology that Africa needs for fast development. As Africans, mostly we are confused by ourselves. We learn to think that it is impossible to overcome the Western domination. I learned that if you are afraid of other human beings, you will miss the most important things in your life. When the ancient African people failed to initiate strong education systems to all African people, the modern Western leaders took advantage of this knowledge to control African people through our own mindsets or thinking and dominate the global economic systems. The West colonized Africa and succeeded through the application of DTCTC systems, as most Africans did not have the strong positive mindset development. They then divided the African countries and controlled their resources by introducing their education systems. Firstly, they imposed their language through an education system which gave them control over African mindsets. This allowed them to control any resistance against colonial powers. Secondly, a brand new religion, Christianity, was introduced and further entrenched by the establishment of African education systems controlled by Christian missionaries during post-1900. This allowed them to introduce all learners to the new mindset, before the start of any learning session, to first pray and believe through the medium of their fresh religious books of Christianity, the Bible. Before the colonization era, the Quran was already prevalent. brought by Arabs from the Islamic faith. This was during the trade on the Indian Ocean and Red Sea between some African kingdoms doing business throughout the Arabic Empire. This, as well, was achieved during the period of the Caliphate Empire controlling some of the African areas. The Quran was distributed especially in some of the modern Eastern, Western and Northern African countries. The traditional African religion was actively discouraged as primitive and faithless, and this helped to forge a new identity based on these Abrahamic religions imported into Africa from Europe and the Arabic world. Some of the Western leaders, in order to maintain total control of the DTCTC systems, used these religions as opportunities through African leaders. The Abrahamic religion systems and the modern media help some division systems, which dominate the Africans' mindsets. Today some of the new Abrahamic religions branches have been showing Africans that their traditional religions are incompatible with Christianity as well as Islam, as discussed more in Section 3. This created some confusion that helps assist the functionality of the DTCTC systems, which deliberately distort some of the African people's mindset in the form of religious conflict. In order to win the control of African peoples, some of the Western leaders continue to support some corrupt African leaders, so that they can maintain and control their interest. This is the reason why any person who is reading this book must understand that your mindset is the key to everything you want to achieve for the rest of your life. During the colonization era, the DTCTC systems masters realized that many African people did not have the same levels of education. The technological sophistication, which was the foundation of European society, has made the Africans vulnerable to manipulation. It's one of the best ways they used to win Africa and to control its people. The first thing they did was to create divisions between African families by dividing the continent into new sections, known as countries. These decisions were established during the Berlin Conference, held in Germany, 1884–85 CE. Later again, they divided each country's map into North, South, East and West, based on ethnic group divisions. They separated Africans from each other and disguised the fact that their origins were rooted in the same families within the regions they came from. They created the identity card, ID, in some countries. The ID represented the differences of ethnicity, group, color and area of origin. Today, the passport continues to indicate that we are from different countries in the land of our own kin, who speak unlike languages but related to each other. Later, we lost the prehistory over the centuries during the presence of Europeans in Africa. The division of African kingdoms, under Western leaders, forced us to have a permit, visa, to enter, live or visit our own family's lands, otherwise you get deported. The Western leaders themselves understood the effect of visa, and that division will retard their development. They do not have much division or ethnic groups, as they supported for Africans. They created the Union Kingdoms, UK, established in 1536, England and Wales united, 1707, the Scottish and English and Wales united and established United Kingdom of Great Britain, and 1801, the Kingdom of Great Britain united with Ireland and established the sovereign state of UK. Today, 2018, only the north of Ireland is part of UK, and South Ireland is an independent country in Europe. In addition, the European Union, EU, 28 of European states united as one sovereign country. This was established to control the internal borders, an area within which citizens, many non-EU nationals, business people and tourists can freely circulate without being subjected to border checks, started in 1951. Lastly, the United States of America, the USA, 52 states united and established one sovereign country, established in 1789. This allowed citizens from the Union of countries or regions to travel freely anyway to discover much in their continent and shared ideas to build better living conditions of their people. We, as Africans, are still looking at each other as enemies, internally in each country and one sovereign nation among other nations. This is because we were taught that we are not family. today most of our countries are always waiting for Western leaders, bosses, to come up with solutions and help us on our chronic problems. The Western ideologies to control African people's mindset during the colonization era were successful in dividing people into sectors. One sector throughout the country was trained with intellectual knowledge, administrative and educational systems, another sector with military knowledge, military systems like the army and police. This division led to the establishment of different identities, often at odds with one another. In the years that followed, the system promoted differences and contestation and eventually led to violence and wars to moderate this frustration. To date, 2018, the majority of Africans are still influenced in the same mentalities. For example, the majority on one side of each territory of some African countries tended to focus on military systems or violence, and the remaining side of the same country on educational, business and administrative systems. These two distinct systems, along with unlike languages, are devised to separate. This divided the countries along different civilizing and ideological lines, which promotes a climate of antipathy between the two groups that made it far easier to institute control over the country by the colonizing powers. This power planted the philosophies of civilization, which came to advise and separate the people. This made them start to consider each other as enemies, with each believing the other to be inferior just because they were unlike, and fomented distrust in each other and greater trust in their DTCTC masters, some Western leaders. The assistance of the DTCTC masters was often offered in the guise of help. However, conditions attached involved ongoing payment systems to entrench influence and power. Meanwhile, weapons assisted with controlling the so-called enemy. Those same weapons still had to be paid for or exchanged with minerals and land exploitations. This also had a twofold effect. First, to maintain control, and secondly, to reinforce notions of superiority and inferiority emanating from introducing this technology, which was being used to maintain control during the war against other identities. In this way the masters continue to get what they want. They have control over the majority of African territories through DTCTC systems, as well as the economic advantage of minerals and land exploitations and selling of weapons. This system continues to confuse African people. We do not yet have a strong system of education or philosophies that could unite our viewpoint and populations. If one group of people opposes another in a country, the DTCTC masters will assist one group to make sure that their power is not disturbed. At the same time, the other group that has support from the master will never be allowed to understand or be given a chance to communicate and find alternative solutions with the opponents. They will prefer the military option or violence way, like strikes. African people have often continued to live this way by focusing on the false notion that one group is inferior to another. The downside of this for Africans is that this allows the DTCTC system to work perfectly within our continent. Through this policy, some of the Western leadership maintain their total control of the African people's mindset. African people continue to enslave themselves through their own mindset by thinking negatively about their other families. Consequently, we consider the other side of the same country or other countries as enemies. What we do not notice is that the manufacturer of the enemy is the one who came to divide people into subgroups and sub-areas. If their role becomes known, and if they let these people get together to try and genuinely solve their differences, they will lose their control and all the advantages that go along with it. It, therefore, becomes essential for African people to overcome this blindness and gain access to their own positive mindsets.
Some examples of how this system played out in colonized countries in Africa through maintenance of the DTCTC system are: the British controlled the Uganda people from 1894 to 1962, through the form of DTCTC systems. They used the strategy of giving one side of people an opportunity for education, economic and political advantage. The northern people were mostly recruited in the army and police, with both sides speaking different languages. This separation has led to years of misunderstanding and conflict, which has served no one but only benefited the Western leaders. The areas of business, weapon sales and assistance organizations, which create jobs for other continents, are some of the areas of benefit. The British controlled Sudan from 1869 to 1956. They ruled the Arabic Muslims community to the north and introduced Christianity to the blacks in the south. Later, Sudan ended up to a division into the North and South Sudan, along with all the violence of the different types of conflicts, ethnic groups, political and religion, through attacking one another. Further, the division benefited more the West, in many forms of business. Belgium colonized Rwanda and Burundi, from 1916 to 1962. They planted the ideas of the Hutu as the workforce and the Tutsi as the extenders of Belgian rule and the controller of the national mindset. Before the colonization, the two families worked, mixed and lived together and spoke the same languages as one lovely family. Afterwards, the DTCTC system, brought by Belgium, exploded and led to thousands of deaths of both ethnic group members, with two undesirable events. The genocide of Hutu, in 1972, in Burundi, caused over 200,000 of Hutu people died. The genocide of Tutsi in 1994 in Rwanda saw almost 800,000 of Tutsi people slaughtered in 3 months. The French colonized Congo-Brazzaville from 1883 to 1960. The most northern people were given the advantage of military training. The southern people were trained for political education. Once again, we can see how this division has promoted civil wars, caused along ethnic lines. The DRC was colonized by the Belgians, from 1885 to 1908 by King Leopold II and from 1908 to 1960 by the Belgian government. They destabilized the system and maintained control by manipulating a conflict with Patrice Lumumba on one side, and Moise Tshombe on the other side within the country. The DRC had military bases and a planned DTCTC system to destabilize the country. The masters manipulated the situation and ended up assassinating Patrice Lumumba because of his plan to build a united country. This was for the interest of all people and would have eliminated the divisions that existed for so long, in the interest of the masters. This policy of division was also tried in South Africa during racial segregation and discrimination, apartheid, between different black ethnic groups. Basically, between the two popular groups, the Xhosa and Zulu people, system forces conspired to confuse and promote violence and division. Other divisive strategies involved giving colored people more opportunities compared to black people, and all non-white students were forced to speak the language of the white oppressor, Afrikaans, so as to divide them and prevent them from being one people. Credit goes to the wise liberation leaders and political party movements of South Africa. The majority of them did not fully support these manipulations at all. This allowed them to thrive, until the end of apartheid. This section has focused on only a few countries to highlight how this strategy was used to create division among the peoples of Africa to maintain control. Many countries' strategies are not mentioned throughout this section. However, they follow a similar pattern, and further research should be devoted to exploring these examples. In addition, Section 5, Volume 2 of 2, discusses more statistics and a short history of each African country. This will help you to explore more about how the DTCTC system was planted into the African continent. Experience may continue to prove to us that the majority of Africans are cultured with the ideology of seeing another person who speaks an unlike African language as a stranger, that they are not part of our pure family, and even more damaging, as inferiors. African people have adopted this culture. We are treating other people from the north or south of the same country, or even from different areas within the south who speak another language, as strangers. However, linguistic research can prove most of these languages came from the same group of language families as described more in Section 5 of this book, Volume 2 of 2. African family origins and the languages we speak are all derived from a limited set of original families that are closely related. These have moved before and during the slavery era and later suffered division during colonization. All ethnic groups and the languages we speak are all descendants of four main groups of African families, including other smaller numbers of the world families. In the 20th century, 58 years ago, African people were under the control of Western colonizers. Today, in the 21st century, 2018, we are still under control, through the same colonizing economics, through the DTCTC system, with the help of some corrupt African leaders' mindsets. Starting with Egypt's independence in 1922, African countries started to be freed by the colonizers. Followed by Libya in 1951, Algeria, Morocco and Sudan in 1956, until 1957 where Kwame Nkrumah succeeded to free Ghana. His success spirited the majority of countries' liberations from the colonizing countries around 1960. After 1960, fewer countries were still under different systems of colonies. For example, one of them was South Africa. Since 1948 and after the independence, in May 1961, the ruling political party, led by white South Africans, changed the constitution. It gave birth to apartheid, a system to deliberately divide the unity of South Africa. The South African government maintained the colonizers' white domination over black South Africans. Many black leaders and some devoted white leaders of South Africa, with the help from other African countries, fought against the apartheid system. This was successfully achieved with international help, particularly from the Soviet Union, Russia, under different leaders, as well as Cuba, under Fidel Castro, among others. They assisted in the quest for freedom. Included were some African countries, especially the majority of African Union leaders. History shows that the late President Samora Moises Machel, born 1933 and died 1986, from Mozambique, died allegedly due to the forces released during the conflict of apartheid in South Africa. Some of the African countries and their leaders assisted along, including Libya, under the late Muammar Gaddafi, Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, Zaire, now DRC, under the late Mobutu Sese Seko, Burkina Faso, under the late Thomas Sankara, Congo Brazzaville, under Denis Sassou Nguesso, Gabon, under the late Omar Bongo, Tanzania under the late Julius Nyerere, Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda, among other African countries' leaders. These leaders stood up against the South African apartheid in different ways of assistance: communication, food, clothing, armies, among others, to the black South Africans. These African leaders, international help and the massive forces of citizens of South African leaders fighters, managed to end apartheid on the 27th of April 1994. This led one of the South African black fighter heroes of peace, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, to becoming the first black president of South Africa. After all African countries won their freedom from the colonizing countries, there was physical freedom, but the mentality among the majorities of African people still under control by the Western ideologies prevailed. As a result of today, 2018, many African leaders have continued to fail their people and Africa. They maintain the power, rather than giving a chance to other Africans, who might be able to solve the problems. They cling to power and prefer to be controlled mentally and spiritually by the same colonizing countries. These incompetent and self-regarding leaders crush many dreams and futures of the majority of African youths. This is due to selfishness among some radical African countries' leaders. The ex-colonizing countries have used this opportunity to accomplish their promises to their own populations to protect their jobs through the DTCTC systems. This caused some of the African leaders to get into trouble with their own people through colonial mindsets that do not serve the dreams or foster opportunities for Africa's people. I always say, a successful person is one who might be in control physically, but not spiritually and mentally by another person, and a failure is a person who has been controlled spiritually and mentally but not physically by another person. Some of the policies have been used by some African leaders against their people and any opposition. This has facilitated the Western leaders to make business by selling weapons and sending agents to assist the companies, selling news and controlling the media. This allowed the master to achieve their dreams. Technology is a new factor behind the drive to find solutions to Africa's problems. An important feature of the technology is that it develops at an increasingly rapid pace and therefore offers new solutions on a continuing basis. However, in order to take advantage of technology, we need to train our people, in particular ways, skills and mindset development, and critical thinking. Some of these options are not yet taken seriously by some corrupt leaders. Instead, some continue to confuse their people and fail to alleviate their people's suffering. Currently, the problems of African suffering, poverties, criminalities, civil wars and xenophobia, among others, are caused by our own mindset, even more so our radical leaders. No Western leaders will come to solve our problems if we don't continue to take strong action ourselves, instead of solving our problems. Some countries' leaders have been adding more and more problems to the pile, weighing Africa down. How can you expect someone to help you with your dreams when you yourself do not understand your own dream and how to plan it? Anyone can take advantage of you if you don't know what you want to do. The only time that a person will be able to help you in your dream is when you take control of your dream by yourself and start working on it by valuing it and improving your ideas. This is what will impress others, in order to give you a hand, and then the same people who rejected you will start to treat you differently. This is one of the reasons why this book is also addressed to African elders, politicians and religious leaders. It's our effort and desire to change the manipulation of African people. Today, the Chinese are investing in Africa. The Western nations are also trying to boost their investments in Africa, because of the rise of China in Africa. It is important to understand at this time, when they are competing with interests for investments in Africa, we as Africans need to realize that to maintain and change the continent we must work 10 times more than the investor, otherwise, we are going to sell our lands to the new investors. We need to find many ways to control our future to avoid total domination by other continents. We need to learn to take responsibility for our own futures. We need to find solutions that serve our own interests by depending on ourselves, with less help from other continents. What follows is a brief biography of the 6 top African heroes I have chosen to highlight in this book. They serve as role models in my desire to contribute to developing the African mindsets and set African people on a path to a future controlled by their own dreams. Biography of the 6 African fighters. Fighter 1, Kwame Nkrumah. Biography. Kwame Nkrumah was born in a small village of Groflinzima, a modern district in the western region of Ghana, on September 21, 1909. He died on April 27, 1972. His full name was Francis Y. Kofi Nkrumah, and he changed his name to Kwame Nkrumah in 1945. He was titled with different names, like the Black Star, Father of African Nationalism, Pride of Africa. He served the Gold Coast, which was later renamed Ghana, as the leader of government business from 1951 to 1957. After independence, he served Ghana again, as Prime Minister from 1957 to 1960, and as President from 1960 to 1966. Family: Father, Opani Nkofi Ngoloma. Mother, Elizabeth Nyaniba. Wife, Helena Itzfathia. On December 31, 1957, he married an Egyptian and relative of President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. The couple had 3 children, namely, Gamal Gorkaya Nkrumah, Samia Yaba Christina Nkrumah, and Siku Nkrumah. He also had the first son named Francis Kwesi Nkrumah with another woman. Nkrumah grew up in colonial times when the Ghanaians were despised by the colonialists. His parents were determined that he receive some education. In 1915, they sent him to a Roman Catholic elementary school at Hafasini, one of the towns of Ghana. The young Nkrumah loved studying, reading philosophies and debate. He was eager for new knowledge. His visions of leadership started at a young age, with the help of his mother who encouraged him to depend on himself and overcome his challenges. Nkrumah got inspired by James M. Nkwejiagri, born on October 18, 1875, died on July 30, 1927, who lectured the Africans about the great achievements of their ancestors that made an impact before the arrival of the Europeans. Nkwejiagri encouraged education to some African leaders who became great leaders in Africa. Dr. Agri was one of the African leaders who strongly believed in racial cooperation to harmonize the black and white races. Nkrumah also got inspiration from Marcus Garvey's vision, born in 1887, died in 1940, who influenced his ideas on the ideology of Pan-Africanism, Africa for Africans. This idea aimed to unite the African people to fight against colonialism, for liberty, equality and independence. Today, in the 21st century, we still need to fight against the DTCTC system, mindset and economic liberations. By the 1920s, Nkrumah at school was a very bright student. In 1926, he was accepted as a student at the Prince of Wales College, modern, Uwakimota College in Accra, capital of Ghana, formally opened in January 1927 by the principal of the college Alexander Garden Fraser, born 1873, died 1962. There, he continued his higher education. At this college, he met Dr. Nkwejiagri, the first vice principal of Uwakimota College, who awakened his cultural nationalism, which led him into the idea of taking his education further at the University of Lincoln, in the United States. After a few months in July 1927, Dr. Nkwejiagri died. By the 1930s, African countries did not have the high-quality education, and Nkrumah's parents were not able to support his tertiary education outside Africa. In 1930, he obtained a senior teacher's certificate and became a teacher at a Roman Catholic school at Elmina in the Central Region. Later, he was promoted to a Roman Catholic seminary at Amisno in the Central Region in 1933, as a teacher. His vision required more than what was available in Africa. He got more inspired and motivated again, by Benjamin Nnamdi Azikiwe, born in 1904, died in 1996, the first president of Nigeria. Azikiwe also fought for African countries' independence. In 1934, Azikiwe took up a position as an editor for the African Morning Post, a daily newspaper in Accra. In that position, Azikiwe promoted a pro-African nationalist agenda. Azikiwe and the daily newspaper encouraged Nkrumah in his determination to focus on his dream and to go to the United States for his further education. However, he faced a financial challenge because he did not have enough money to travel and for his study fees. He got funds for the trip and his education from relatives, together with his own thriftiness in saving. From 1935 to 1947, Nkrumah traveled to America, but there were still tuition fees to seek for the University of Lincoln, where he obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Sociology in 1939 and a bachelor's degree in Sacred Theology in 1942. However, he never gave up. He had to work on weekends or at night and attend classes during the day. He used to work at different part-time jobs to save money for fees, even studying hard to accomplish his dream. After his first graduation in 1939, he began to teach at Lincoln that same year. Nkrumah, as a visionary, started attending many debates and conferences to learn more about Africa. He created relationships with many leaders and politicians throughout the world who were against the colonial system, which gave him the power to reach his dream. Later, he completed a Master of Science degree in Education and a Master of Arts degree in Philosophy, at the University of Pennsylvania in 1942 and 1943, respectively. By the 1940s, he had started showing an interest in his vision of uniting all Africans in the United States. He hoped that they might one day return home to serve Africa. His philosophy, visions and work led to the first General Conference of Africans in America held in September 1943. In this period, he became a remarkable African with ideologies of delivering the suffering of African people, to end the grip of colonialism and imperialism. He achieved much knowledge as what he wanted, although failed to complete his doctoral degree in philosophy. In 1945, he went to the UK to pursue a doctoral degree in political science at the London School of Economics. Nkrumah continued to work for decolonization and got involved more in political issues around the African continent. In the same period, of 1945, he wrote his first book, Towards Colonial Freedom, and other books, with titles, I Speak of Freedom, 1958, Africa Must Unite, 1963, Consciencism, 1964, following the most popular one, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, 1965, and the last one being The Challenge of the Congo, 1966. In 1947, he returned to Ghana, where they offered him a post as General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, party. In 1948, the UGCC party was accused of organizing the boycott of foreign products that led to riots in Accra. Following, Nkrumah and several other UGCC leaders were arrested by British colonial authorities and briefly imprisoned. In June 1948, he formed a youth party under UGCC, named the Committee of Youth Organizations, CYO. This party later became the Convention People's Party, CPP. Then in September 1948, he was dismissed as General Secretary of UGCC. After Nkrumah's dismissal, the youth had decided to break away from the parent body to form an independent political party, because they refused to accept the decision taken by the elders. Nkrumah continued to promote his ideas of liberation and became the central figureman to the major debates and issues during the decolonization period from the 1950s to the 1960s. By the 1950s, all African countries were under the control of the Western colonies, except Ethiopia, which was not controlled by the colonialists, and Egypt, which was freed in 1922. Ghana and Kenya appeared as the only two remarkable British colonies to stand up for their independence on the continent. Both major countries' nationalist leaders Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta were constantly in the news. Nkrumah followed Dr. Kwame Oruge's ideologies in fighting equality with non-violence. Black and white worked together. However, he developed his own positive mindset that Oruge's ideologies would only be achieved when the African people take authority of their lands. In 1950, Nkrumah was arrested again, due to his positive action campaign that created disturbances. He spent a couple of months in prison again. When he was in prison, he continued to support the CCP, through written letters, which helped and guided the party's leaders to participate in the general elections. In 1951, the party won the majority seats in the assembly. A modern executive council was constituted, although the CPP insisted on its presiding majority. They freed Nkrumah from prison, in February 1951. In the following days, the party invited Nkrumah to become the Gold Coast's leader of government business. In between 1951 to 1957, the CPP was in command throughout the country. On the 6th of March 1957, the CPP party, under the leading of Nkrumah, freed the Gold Coast from the British. They changed the name to Ghana, name adopted from one of the African kingdoms, namely Ghana Empire, located in Mali and Mauritania territories. Nkrumah did not only stop after freeing Ghana. After Ghana's liberation, Nkrumah proclaimed that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless linked to the total liberation of the African continent. From this period, he energized all the rest of the African countries' leaders, who rose up massively to fight for their liberation. His dream encouraged many other African leaders who began the long struggle for freedom across Africa. After the independence, Nkrumah was elected as a prime minister. In 1960, he was elected as the first president of the Republic of Ghana. Later, in 1963, he pursued a Pan-African policy, and in 1964, he formed a one-party state, with himself as president of the party. Later, he was accused of actively promoting a cult of his own person. On February 24, 1966, a military coup d'état, with the help of Western backing, toppled Nkrumah, and he fled the country. He spent his last years in exile and died in 1972, at Bucharest, Romania. His legacy and dream of uniting Africans failed, due to the DTCTC system. However, his ideas still remain a goal among many Africans. Many other books that speak about him will inspire you more about his life and other dreams. For example, he supported strongly the idea of uniting all African countries as one country. He also stressed for the liberations of other Africans' problems, such as racism, segregation, like the case of apartheid in RSA, and job creations, among others. He continued to fight and looked forward to changing the continent and wrote books until his end. Our great ideas and dreams of helping people around us may encourage other people to make big changes. The AYI company's vision is to continue encouraging and inspiring all African youth to wake up and understand that the happiness of the continent lies in their hands. This can be achieved by standing in cooperation and fighting for their future and for the continent. To start working together with a positive mindset and learn more from great leaders, as in Kwame Nkrumah's achievement. Fighter 2 Jomo Kenyatta. Biography. Jomo Kenyatta was born in between 1889 and 1895 in Genda village, Gatundu, a small town in Kiambu County of Kenya, from the Kikuyu ethnic group. There is no proper birth date referred from his parents. He died on the 22nd of August 1978 in his home in Mombasa. He was the first Kenyan Prime Minister from 1963 to 1964 and then President from 1964 to 1978. He is endearingly referred to as the founding father of the nation, Kenya. In his childhood, he was called Kamau Wanjenji. He published a book in 1938 entitled Facing Mount Kenya, where he used the name Jomo Kenyatta. From that period people embraced Jomo Kenyatta as his name. Family: father, Njenji Wamugai; mother, Wambui; wife, in 1920, he married his first wife, Grace Wu. The couple had 2 children, Peter Mugai Kenyatta and Margaret Rose Wambui. In 1942, he married his second wife, Edna Clark, in England. The couple had one son, Peter Magana. When he returned to Kenya in 1946, he married his third wife, Grace Wanjiku. The couple had one child called Jane Wambui. After the death of Wanjiku, later in 1951, he married his fourth wife, Njina Kenyatta, also known as Mom Njina. The couple had 4 children: Christine Wambui Kenyatta, Uoru Kenyatta, Ananya Kabi Muthama, Muhoka Kenyatta. The young Kenyatta grew up in Njenda, sublocation of Gatundu. His life at Njenda was hard. At an early age, he left his parents and went to live with his grandfather at Muthiga, central Kenya. After some years, probably at between the ages of 11 to 17, in 1909, Kenyatta was in trouble with his foot and traveled to Thogoto, central Kenya, for care. There he was impressed by the Scotland missionaries and determined to join the mission school. Later, he joined the Church of Scotland Mission. He began life at Thogoto, where he learns much about reading and writing skills. He studied, among other subjects, the Bible, English, mathematics, and practiced carpentry. He completed the training in 1912, and in 1914 he was baptized and adopted a Christian name, Johnston Camow. After the World War I, 1914 to 1918, Britain took over the government of the former German colony area of Tanganyika, Tanzania today. They dominated the majority of Eastern Africa territories. In 1920, Britain changed the status of Kenya from the protectorate to a colony. After the war, many British soldiers, seeking a better life, immigrated to Kenya, and most of the Kenyan lands were taken by British owners. At this time, more Kenyans were educated from the missionary schools. The ethnic group of Kika, keen to defend their lands, founded a political party named Kika Central Association, KCA, in between 1920 to 1925. The KCA was led by James Ptu and Joseph Kangath. In the same period, Kenyatta traveled to Nairobi, capital city, to seek for better employment and got a job in the Nairobi municipality. Later, Kenyatta got interested in politics and joined KCA. He was forced to choose between his job and politics by the municipality leaders, after joining the political party. He chose to leave the job as well and began to edit the movement's Kika newspaper. In 1928, he became the General Secretary of KCA and launched a monthly Kika language newspaper, called Muigwithanaya, Reconciler, which aimed to unite all sections of the Kika clan and make representations on the Kika land problems. At the same period, the British started plans to form a union of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika, as one federation. The Kika people started to worry about their land interests. Later, the KCA sent Kenyatta to London to represent their land grievances to the colonial government in 1929. He came back discouraged by the lack of an official response to the land claims he was putting forward. After the colonial office ignored his efforts, he thought to improve his level of education. From 1932 to 1933, he briefly studied economics in Moscow, the capital city of Russia. In 1934, Kenyatta enrolled at the University College, London. From 1935, he studied social anthropology and published his first book in 1938 named Facing Mount Kenya, among other books in the following years. In 1946, a political party, the Kenyan African Union, KAU, was formed to campaign for African independence, and Jomo Kenyatta was elected president of the KAU after Juntas Gikaru stepped down for him. He started to embark on a huge campaign to alert Kenyans on the importance of getting back their lands and independence from the British colony. This is one of his quotes. When the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land, and the missionaries had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with eyes closed. When we opened them, they had the land, and we had the Bible. He began to receive death threats from white settlers after his election. In 1951, the party, KAU, issued some point demands to the colonial government. The government rejected the demands. This led to more violent protests and the rise of rebellion more that began in 1952. This violence led the white rulers to declare a state of emergency. Jomo Kenyatta, together with other African leaders, were accused of illegally supporting the violence. They were arrested and imprisoned at the end of 1952. In 1953, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison and got released in 1959 but under house arrest. During the Republican period, the More continued to fight against white domination, while other African countries started to get independence. In 1960, Britain announced plans to prepare Kenya to be ruled by the majority, Africans. Another party, Kenya African National Union, KANU, was formed by Tom Mboya and Oginga Odinga. In 1961, Kenyatta was freed and assumed presidency of KANU, to unite the ethnic groups. In 1963, Kenya gained independence, with Kenyatta as Prime Minister of the autonomous Kenyan government. Queen Elizabeth II remained as head of state. By 1964, the Republic of Kenya was formed. Kenyatta became the first president of Kenya, until his death in 1978. Later, some of the lands taken by the colonizers were given back to some African families. Kenyatta was a non-stop fighter after he failed on his attempts. He looked forward. Upon furthering his education, he pursued again his efforts and managed to get some of the lands back for his people. Today we can learn from his determination. As African people, we can only enjoy and work to free the African continent economically, by working hard and looking forward to better education systems that will develop all African people's mindset at early ages, as Kenyatta's achievement can inspire us. Fighter 3 Emery Patrice Lumumba. Biography. Emery Patrice Lumumba was born in the village of Onaliwa, located in the administrative zone of Katakokombe, in the Democratic Republic of Congo DRC, on the 2nd of July 1925. He served the DRC as Premier Minister from 1960 to 1961 and was assassinated on the 17th of January 1961 by the Belgian mercenaries with the support of his opposition at Katanga, administrative zone of DRC. He fought and stood behind the idea of seeing African people enjoy their freedom, and he supported the ideas of Pan-Africanism. Family: father, Francois Tolinga Techima; mother, Julie Nwamato Lamenda; first wife, Hortense Sombosia, married in 1947. The couple had one child, who bears the same name as his father, Francois Tolinga. They divorced in 1951. The same year he married again, Paulino Pango. They had 4 children, Patrice Lumumba Okend, Julie N. Lumumba, Roland Gilbert Lumumba and Marie-Christine Lumumba. His last son Guy Patrice Lumumba was born out of wedlock with Alphonsine Batumba. She was his secretary, from when his party won the elections until his death. The young Patrice grew up during the period where the Belgian colonialism was brutal to all Congolese. He attended his elementary education in a Catholic missionary school. In the 1940s, Lumumba moved to the city of Stanleyville, modern Kisangani, to look for better opportunities. He studied further at the post office school, in the city of Leopoldville, modern Kinshasa. By the 1950s, he became one of the leading figures among the Congolese, a politics writer, cultural organizer and philosopher. He got involved in political activities. In 1954, he found a job as a postal clerk and worked in both cities, Stanleyville and Leopoldville. He became a community leader and organized a postal workers' labor union. In 1956, he was sent to prison for apparently embezzling money from the post office where he worked. After he got released from prison in 1957, a new job was offered to him as a director of beer promotion within a company called Brackengo Brewery in Leopoldville. As a figureman, the new job was a great opportunity to promote the beer as well as his political ideologies. He traveled from bar to bar in the cities where he had an opportunity to meet with several Congolese. He did this in the evenings, in the bars of the cities with African neighborhoods. These meetings led to the foundation of the MNC, Movement National Congolese, political party in 1958, with Lumumba as the president. It aimed to represent all Congolese. Some other politicians were leading a political struggle within the country, and the city was far much interracial between citizens. In 1958, Kwame Nkrumah organized an event called the 6th Pan-African Conference. Lumumba and 2 other members of MNC attended the conference, where he made his first most celebrated speeches, on the 11th of December 1958. At the beginning of 1959, Lumumba resigned from the brewery and focused more on leading MNC to seek a way forward. In the same period of the 1950s, the Congolese began to expect independence and freedom. Consequently, in January 1959, one of the uprisings among the people, against the colonialism, at Leopoldville, caused the death of a couple of people. At this period, the Congolese started to taste some freedom. The native courts were ignored. They refused to pay taxes as usually charged by the Belgian government. At the end of March 1959, Lumumba made demands to Belgium for an independent state. In April 1959, Lumumba called for a congress in Luluabourg, modern Kananga, to unite all political leaders, as one government that would lead in harmony, all the regions and ethnic groups into one nation. After the uprising of the Congolese with bitterness towards the colonial power, the city was not working properly. Some Belgian bosses paid low salaries and people started to complain. This led to the main trade union conference between the Congolese politicians and the Belgian authority to discuss salaries. During the conference, the speeches of Lumumba drove some Congolese to rise up and cause damage and a couple of deaths in Stanleyville. This led Lumumba to be put into prison again in November 1959, on charges of having worked up the population into rages of anger and disobedience. While in prison, Belgium organized the elections and the MNC won the majority. By January 1960, Lumumba was taken to Belgium to attend the Round Table Conference in Brussels. The Belgian government organized the conference, in which all Congolese political parties could represent their policies on how to run their country's future. At the conference, Lumumba's ideology dominated all other party leaders. His efforts and ideas helped the MNC to lead Congo into independence from Belgium. At the end of his imprisonment term, the party called for the release of their president, and Belgium agreed to use the day of his release as the Independence Day of the Congo, on the 30th of June 1960. This independence led to the formulation of the first government of DRC. The first president was Joseph Kasavubu, and Lumumba had taken two positions, of Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. In his main speech, President Kasavubu praised the former colonizers and thanked the Belgian king for giving them freedom and having treated them well. The cruelty and slave-like conditions in the Belgian colonies were possibly one of the worst on the entire continent, and Lumumba was not happy with this speech. When his time came, he stood up and spoke of their long struggle for independence, telling the people never to forget how they were treated by their colonizing masters. Patrice never trusted the Belgians, because they never really worked for DRC people, but only advanced their own interests. To date, the DRC is rich in minerals and various players are promoting conflicts within the country, while the media never reveals the true causes of these conflicts. The controllers are vying for natural resources and conflicts which suit their purpose, with rebels that seem to be provided with weapons for maintaining control of these natural resource areas. He revealed this conspiracy to the Congolese, telling them not to trust their ex-colonizers, as proven. No West nor African Union leaders had decided to end these conflicts permanently, which led to several civil wars that have caused thousands of Congolese family to deaths. This continues to date, in 2018, with the only victors sitting in some Western countries. They are benefiting from the incomes as well as some of the radical African leaders who support these conflicts. He believed the answer was to stabilize the DRC and work for the benefit of all African countries. He dreamt to see all Africans to live a better life by proving to the colonizers that African people could work constructively for themselves. This is an excerpt of some of his speech after the independence for the DRC. Today, in the free and independent Congo, we must not have a Bangla, National Unity Party, Association of Congo, Mu Congo, Batitla or local youth, but a united, Congolese, nationalist, democratic youth. This youth will serve the social and economic revolution of our great and beloved country. You must energetically combat tribalism, which is a poison, a social scourge that is the country's misfortune today. You must combat all the separatist maneuvers, which some of the preachers of the policy of division are trying to pass off to young and inexperienced people under the name of federalism, federation or confederation. Because of his ideas and speech against the imperialists and encouraging his people to make changes, the DRC peoples lost control and stood up against all white people in the country. Later, Belgium sent its military to protect its people, and in the process could regain control. Lumumba was demonized and certain voices started to call him Satan. Some of the Western countries' leaders did not want to see peace in the DRC, and they were not happy with Lumumba's ideologies. In order to achieve their aims, they used the DTCTC system, ethnic group division, by supporting some radical leaders to take back their control of DRC lands. These included Moise Tshombe, a leader of Katanga, old province of DRC, which is mineral-rich. Tshombe formed another government to fight against Patrice Lumumba's government that demanded the division of the country. Belgium supported him with heavy weapons to fight against the government of Lumumba. While Lumumba was focusing on uniting the ethnic group leaders' tension and sought for international help, most of the Western countries couldn't support him. This started to affect his leadership and the control of the country. Economically, he managed to get some help from the Soviet Union, Russia. In the same period, he replaced one of the Belgian top leaders of the Congolese army and promoted Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko, second president of DRC from 1965 to 1997, as the head of the Congolese National Army. President Joseph Kasavubu got into confusion from the Western influence. He started to use Lumumba's alleged communism to get rid of him from the government. While Western leaders focused on the control of DRC mineral areas, the Congolese leaders concentrated on division. Western countries planned to topple Lumumba in order to gain the total control of DRC. They had control over the army leaders on the government in place. In September 1960, Kasavubu, with the pressure of Belgian authority, attempted to remove Lumumba and appoint a new government. He failed his mission after the announcement on the radio. Lumumba rushed to parliament and succeeded to convince the Congolese parliament members. After Kasavubu failed to remove Lumumba, the Western leaders used the DTCTC system in another way. They corrupted and supported Mobutu to organize a bloodless coup that effectively removed Kasavubu and Lumumba from power. In this period, Lumumba could not communicate with his supporters. The Western leaders were still worried about his presence because he had influence and huge support, if he gained the opportunity to communicate to the Congolese. In October, the Belgian police required his physical elimination, and he was under house arrest. By the 27th of November, he fled the capital, hoping to reach Stanleyville to reach his supporters. However, he was caught by the army and arrested. Lumumba was beaten in front of TV cameras. He was then sent to Katanga, for Moise Tshombe to finalize his assassination. On the 17th of January 1961, Lumumba and two close friends, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Akoto, were dragged by Katanga forces, commanded by a Belgian officer. They have tortured again, as Tshombe decided on how to kill them. Later, they drove them to nearby woods and shot them to death. They chopped each body part into pieces and burned them in canisters. The misleading of the African mindset, through the DTCTC system, led to Patrice's death and ended his plans for uniting the ethnic groups of DRC. To this day, 2018, the people of the DRC are fleeing from some of the country areas, due to instabilities of the DTCTC system. These have dominated the DRC and some of its corrupt leaders. This can be an experiment lesson for the rest of the African countries, to understand that division and fighting will never solve our chronic problems. Today, countless DRC families live everywhere in the world, unhappy, because of the division of ethnic groups and political parties. After the death of Lumumba, this ended his vision. To date, the entire Congolese generation has to pay back and suffer for some radical leader who tears apart. My question to you as Africans is, are we going to allow or continue supporting the division into ethnic groups, skin colors, political parties and religious ideologies to tear us apart, with our fellow citizens? I guarantee you, It will be a big mistake to leave our children in prison set by our own negative mindset. Patrice believed that Africa would be great one day and said, "The day will come when history speaks. Africa will write its own histories. It will be a history of glory and dignity."
Leadership 1. Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara. Biography. Thomas Sankara was born on the 21st of December 1949, in the town of Yoko, in Burkina Faso. He served Burkina Faso as president from 1983 to 1987, having come to power through popular support. He was assassinated on the 15th of October 1987, at Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, in a coup d'état and buried in Dagnoan Cemetery. He was a pro-Libya and anti-Western. Family: father, Sambo Joseph Sankara; mother, Marguerite Sankara; wife, he married Mariam Serm Sankara, in July 1979, and the couple had 2 children, Philippe Sankara and Auguste Sankara. Sankara developed the ability of visionary leadership at a younger age. He grew up during the end of the colonial period in Goa, one of the departments of Burkina Faso. He faced many challenges of his childhood as all African children were undeveloped mentally. In his time, many children were mostly water carriers, woodcutter, and wood splitters, nail trimmers, hair cutters and serving Europeans, among other activities. He believes in order to change these conditions he needed to involve more in politics and improve the education systems. He understood that the Upper Volta leadership was corrupt and focuses more on Western ideology. As a visionary he decided to join a military at a very young age. At the age of 20s, he was sent for officer training in Madagascar, where he witnessed the popular uprising of the Madagascans against the French-appointed new leader. Later, he attended a parachute academy in France and learned some modern knowledge that developed his mind for his own visionary leadership. He also traveled in different African countries and met several African revolutionary leaders. In 1980, he started speaking against imperialism and built his network within the ranks of the military. By 1981 to 1982, he was appointed as a Minister of Information of Upper Volta and as Prime Minister from January to May 1983. Later, after exposing high levels of corruption to the local journalists, he was dismissed and arrested. His anti-imperialism politics frustrated the Burkinabe leaders. This led him and some of his supporters into prison in Ouagadougou. Because of his vision, the population supported his ideologies and rose up against the government for his arrest. Sankara's friend and military ally Blaise Compaoré supported the uprising crowd in Ouagadougou that toppled the old regime and released Sankara in August 1983, an event known as the August Revolution. At the end of the same year, Sankara became the president. The dream of the visionary started in 1983, with the ambition of introducing the radical communist and anti-imperialist projects on the African continent. When he came to power, the country was extremely poor and undeveloped due to corrupt leadership. As president, he promoted the Democratic and Popular Revolution, RDP Revolution Démocratique et Populaire. He cut the salaries of government and eliminated the spending on luxuries, like expensive cars, whilst the population had nothing to eat. In 1984, on the first anniversary of his accession, he changed the name of the country, which was Upper Volta, to Burkina Faso. It means land of the upright people in Mossi and Dila, the 2 major languages throughout the country. He introduced free education throughout the country. He was the first African president who understood that the systems of education in Africa were poor. He tried to introduce new systems within schools for training youths and new ways of thinking, based on mindset development. His system was training youth through political ideologies, by creating more youth organizations. He was one of the first African leaders who promoted gender equality, whereby a woman could do anything a man was capable of, often against a tradition of semi-slavery. Previously, African women were treated like the possessions of their husbands or fathers. He gave the women authority to seek any work or do any job they wanted to do. He allowed the first African women to be part of the government. He promoted the retention of pregnant women in education, saying to treat them differently from the boys who had impregnated them was a double standard, and that women, even if they fell pregnant, should be permitted to continue their education. Secondly, he fixed a certain day and asked all the men throughout the country to stop working and take responsibility for their wives' duties by going to the market, cooking, cleaning and washing, in order to understand the challenges facing their women and wives before complaining about food preparation, cleaning and other duties designated as women's work. He also started public projects for protecting the environment and encouraged the country to plant trees and build roads to improve the infrastructure throughout the country. He vaccinated the entire population of about 2.5 million children, without external or international help. His government was also the first African government to claim that AIDS, HIV, was a major threat to Africa. Thomas Sankara cared so much for the African continent, as contained in a speech to African soldiers, officers, police and fighters. He raised the point that a soldier without any political or ideological training is a potential criminal. Here is his speech: when you are bearing arms that can spit fire and death, and when you receive orders standing to attention in front of a flag without knowing who will benefit from these orders or these arms, you became a potential criminal, who is just waiting to spread terror around you. How many soldiers are going around Africa in the country after country bringing grief and desolation without understanding that they are fighting men and women who have the same ideas as their own? There are children of workers who see their parents going on strike against reactionary regimes, and yet accept fighting for reactionary leaders when they join the army. So a soldier without any political or ideological training is a potential criminal. This is totally true to date. In 2018, in many African countries, we still see soldiers and policemen receiving their orders from their leaders without first understanding what the benefits of these orders are. They are ready to kill innocent people who should be protected by them. The lack of mindset development and proper education became the instruments of torture and destruction, I say. African armies have become the second power of DTCTC leaders to control and continue ruling African countries by protecting the leaders and reactionary theorizers using our own soldier brothers and sisters to kill us when we are trying to talk and fight for our happiness. Thomas believed too that Western leaders have control over Africans because of lack of production in the African people. In another speech to our community for United African Talk, he said, "Our country produces enough to feed us all. We can even produce more than we need. Unfortunately, for lack of organization, we still need to beg for food aid. This type of assistance is counterproductive and has kept us thinking that we can only be beggars who need aid. We must put aside this type of aid and produce more, because the one who feeds you usually imposes his will upon you. Let's consume what we can control." Thomas revealed how the DTCTC systems are controlling our economies through lack of organization, through African leadership divisions causing African economies to fail to improve or to become independent. It is not about using violence or hating these people, but thinking ahead and thinking about how to organize a proper program that will unite African people to build African economies. This revolutionary leader, in talking about the value of ideas, shares the following statement: "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." On 29 July 1987 at the Organization of African Unity, in a speech on the national debt, Sankara said, "Debt is neocolonialism, in which colonizers transformed themselves into technical assistants. We should better say, technical assassins. We have been advised to go to these lenders. We have been proposed with nice financial setups. We have been indebted for 50, 60 years and even more. That means we have been led to compromise our people for over 50 years and more. Under its current form, that is imperialism controlled, debt is a cleverly managed to reconquer of Africa. After all his great ideas and trying to support the ideas of old leaders to unite and inspire African people, as we might know, the first enemy of African people is their own mindset. His closest friend was used to destroy his ideologies and plan of leadership that could have changed the condition of African people. Thomas was assassinated on the 15th of October 1987 at Ouagadougou. Firstly, Sankara's driver and 2 of his bodyguards were killed in a meeting room. Upon hearing the gunfire, everyone panicked. Sankara told them to stay inside for their own safety. "It's me, they want." He went out, hands raised. He was shot several times and died without saying anything. Then the soldier entered the room and killed everyone inside the meeting room. After his death, Blaise Compaoré denied any involvement in the assassination, claiming he was at home and sick. By the same evening, after the assassination, Compaoré was crowned new president. This shows the level of African people mindset is totally under control by the Western powers, because after the coup, none of the international and national jurisdictions took a proper investigation to find out the cause of the death of the chief of the state of Burkina Faso. Nevertheless, Blaise ruled the country, with the DTCTC system's support, and won the 1991 elections, then subsequently in 1998, 2005 and 2010. He finally stepped down from power, owing to massive resistance from the population in 2014. The lesson to learn is that we as Africans must learn to protect our good leaders and stop betraying each other. Due to the lack of unity, we lost one of the best leaders who was able to inspire and did transform our conditions in Africa. His life also inspires us much on how to become a great leader in this world. Leadership to Muammar al-Gaddafi. Biography. Muammar al-Gaddafi was born on the 7th of June 1942, in a tent, in the desert of the village of Kasr Abu Hadi, located in the Sirte district of Libya. He died on the 20th of October 2011, in a civil war attack in Sirte, city of Libya. A former president of Libya, he was a revolutionary and politician who governed Libya for 41 years, as a primary leader. He took power in a coup d'état in 1969, from the monarchy of King Idris, in a bloodless coup. He became the chairman of the governing Revolutionary Command Council, abolished the kingdom and announced a nation. Note: Gaddafi was one of the dictators in Africa who ruled Libya with his own ideology against Western domination. Because of his radical thinking, his career can be discussed in 2 kinds of personalities. On the negative side, his ideologies cannot be supported. This is because being a dictator, eventually you will have to do some unnecessary acts to maintain power for a long period, which may affect some citizens. However, on his positive side, he was one of the African leaders who got out of his way more to see the happiness of Africans. Because of his beneficial thinking and the contributions for the continent, his ideologies can encourage us to believe that not all African dictators or long-serving presidents are bad. We need to acknowledge why some of the African, so-called bad, leaders maintain power extensively and find a way to work with them wisely. This is to build Africa for the coming generations and get them to exit from power in peace, to avoid the destruction of what we worked for. While the media is very important in our life, sometimes it also leads us to confusion to hate each other or our leaders. Family: father, Muhammad Abdul Salam bin Hamd; mother, Aisha; wife, Mama, married 2 times. In 1969 he married Fatih al-Uri. The couple had 1 son, Muhammad Gaddafi, and divorced after 6 months of marriage. In the same year, he met his nurse Safia Farkash and got married again in 1970. They had 7 children: Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, al-Sadi Gaddafi, Mutasim Billah Gaddafi, Ershor Gaddafi, Hannibal Muammar Gaddafi, Khamis Gaddafi and Saif al-Arab Gaddafi. Gaddafi grew up towards the end of the colonial era and the Second World War period. In the period when Libya's land was one of the fighting front areas between the European empires. He had been born under a poor family and went to school fairly late, after enrolling at a primary school in Sirte. He made the long walk home through the desert every Thursday and returned on Friday night for school, Muslim weekend calendar, until the age of 14. Later, His family moved to the town of Saba in the Fezzan region of Libya. Gaddafi then enrolled at the Saba Secondary School. From this period, Libya gained independence. After the General Assembly, in 1949, the majority of Libyan political leaders decided that Libya should become a sovereign state. They appointed Sayyid Idris al-Senussi as the king of the monarchy. On December 24, 1951, Libya became the second independent country in Africa. At secondary school, the young Gaddafi started to be involved in some political issues as well as the ideology of planning to overthrow the kingdom. During these epochs, the young and educated Libyans were inspired by one of the Egyptian leaders Gamal Abdel Nasser, the second president of Egypt, on the Voice of Cairo, an Egyptian radio. Gaddafi read newspapers, listened to the radio and memorized Nasser's speeches. He could recite them to his schoolmates. These speeches were about Arab pride and unity, to stop the Western imperialism or domination in African lands. This, as his childhood memories of growing up in a country where mines were exploding all over the places, bombs were falling and the Libyan people did not understand the reason why. This was the cause of the Europeans for their own interest. They were fighting each other for authority over African areas. He started to prepare for the revolution at a young age. During the colonial period, about 80% of the Libyan population lived in the hinterlands and indeed lived poverty lives. After the independence, King Idris' political system was much more supported and focused on the Western ideologies and other several factors, rooted in Libya's history that affected the political development of the newly independent country. Some of the European military bases were still in Libya. At school, the young revolutionary Gaddafi developed a high reputation for political analysis. He studied law at the University of Libya. While he was at university, with his vision of anti-Western, he joined the military academy in 1963, with some of his friends. He graduated from the Royal Military Academy in 1965. He thought the monarchy policy, based on Western ideology, would not benefit the nations. Later, he was sent to Britain for further training at the British Army College Staff, in 1966. Later, after his military training, Gaddafi and some of the young Libyan army captains formed a military group, named the Revolutionary Command Council, RCC. This military group organized a coup d'état against King Idris while he was in Turkey for medical treatment. They arrested the army chief of staff and the head of security in the kingdom, in September 1969. The RCC overthrew the government and abolished the kingdom, and in 1972, Colonel Gaddafi was named head of state. Gaddafi, as president, implemented measures to remove what he viewed as the foreign imperialist influence from Libya. He attempts to unify Arab countries. He strengthened ties with Arab nationalist governments, intent on pushing Libya towards Islamic socialism. Before 1969, Libya was one of the poorest African countries. He governed Libya through his ideology and boosted the economic fortunes of Libya that made it one of the greatest countries in Africa, reducing poverty, before his end in 2011. He was a dictator who used his ideology to control the country and save the nation from being controlled by the Western leaders' economics. In 1973, he initiated a popular revolution with the formation of the General People's Committees, purported to be a system of direct democracy, but retained personal control over major decisions. He outlined his Third International Theory that year, publishing these ideas in his first book, The Green Book. Later, he also wrote other books about African politics and general life. He proclaimed low taxes to all Libyans and enabled some poor people with low prices and free access to electricity and water, low petrol prices, free education and healthcare. Some free houses were given to the poor. A salary was granted to all students who finished a high level of school before they got a job. He built the world's largest irrigation project and started agriculture in the desert areas with artificial rivers, which gave Libyans access to a better life. After beginning as an Arab nationalist and Arab socialist, he later governed the country according to his own ideology. He understood what the ex-colonizers of African countries are able to do in Africa to stop the growth of Africa. He nationalized the oil industry, using the increased revenues to bolster the military, implement social programs and fund revolutionary militants across the world. For example, Libya also provided funding and support to South African liberation movements, as well as military training to ANC combatants to end the apartheid regime. The late Nelson Mandela visited Libya in May 1990 to thank Gaddafi for his support for South Africa during the apartheid struggle. Due to his radical ideologies and ideas of anti-imperialism or Western domination, he faced many troubles against the Western countries and suffered under their many sanctions. They, fortunately, failed to control his political power. He created a strong internal system where the country could produce enough resources that assisted the country to grow without much help from outside. This was totally different compared to many African countries that still depend on debt from the Western banks. Gaddafi was one of the African presidents who maintained his confidence in his country's economy without the total control of Western leaders. While there are many wonders and terrible things he did during his time as a leader to control Libya, whatever good and bad he did was for the benefit of the Libyans. Gaddafi's death could be analyzed through many issues concerning the change in Africa. Some may say that because of his dictatorial influence. Nevertheless, the reality can still be proven to us today, in 2018. Since his death, the Libyans have not yet received peace or happiness compared to his period. On the other hand, the African continent lost a hero who had great plans for African nations. His contribution to the change in Africa shows the love he had for the African people and his country. We were left in confusion, based on media propaganda about him. I wonder why one president can love more people of his continent and hate his own people, as the media shows us that he was killing his own people. Malcolm X says, "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power. Because they control the minds of the masses." In 2011, after Gaddafi's death, his son Saif al-Islam Gaddafi was sent for life in prison because of his father and himself being part of the government that killed thousands of Libyans, as reported on the international media. However, 6 years later, in 2017, the same population whose media claimed were killed by Gaddafi, rose up against the Libyan political disturbance to release Gaddafi's son, in which he took back his father's duty as one of the members of the Libyans' politic figure for the benefit of Libyans. On the 11th of June, 2017, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi was released from prison. Let us see what Gaddafi did and planned for the benefit of all African people. 1. In 1992, 45 African nations decided to have their own regional African satellite communication organization, RASCOM. This was for the benefit of African people, so they would spend less money on communication costs on the continent, where a phone call was very expensive in the continent. This was because of the expensive annual fee paid to Europeans, costing about $500 million for the use of its satellites, like Intelsat. The Africans needed international financial help to launch the project, but some of the international conditions scuttled the assistance. Libya, under Gaddafi, alone put USD $300 million on the table. The African Development Bank contributed $50 million and the West African Development Bank, a further $27 million. This led to the realization of the first African communication satellite RASCOM CAF-1, which was launched on the 21st of December 2007. This project created thousands of jobs for Africans and improved the African communications costs, which dropped, as well as increased the African economy. The question is, how much money did the Western countries lose in terms of business after the accomplishment of this project, highly sponsored by Gaddafi, who cared much for African needs? 2. The United States of Africa. It's one of the ideas mentioned first by Marcus Garvey in his poem Hail in 1924. Later, It deeply influenced the birth of the Pan-Africanist movement in 1945. The idea was supported by many African independence fighters. Gaddafi became another influential leader to motivate African people to become a united bloc, and he had the power and influence among African people to accomplish this dream, because of his contribution to African needs. This, owing to realizing the DTCTC system affected the continent's economy. In 2009, Gaddafi joined the Pan-African movement to support and establish the African Union and served as its chairperson from 2009 to 2010. He came up with the ideas of creating one African currency, gold dinar, with a plan that would be started the project in 2011. This would lead African people to be equal, literally, to Western countries, like the United States of America, USA. One of the reasons to introduce the one currency was for the use in oil payments, which would not be in dollars anymore. The use of one African currency was viewed as an invasion by Western economies. This would have had an effect on weakening major currencies such as the euro, US dollar, and the British pound. 3. Gaddafi proposed the African countries' leaders to create 3 African media banks in Africa. The African Monetary Fund would be based in Cameroon and the project would start in 2011. With this bank, African countries would no longer need much help from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to assist in their projects. Big mistake. The IMF would lose some of the businesses, or customers, and possible gain on the fund to African countries, because of one African leader, Gaddafi, the main sponsor of this project. Later, the protocol establishment of the African Monetary Fund took place on June 27, 2014, by the African Union, UN. Finally, on July 4, 2017, the UN approved the project. This is a positive news for Africans and looking forward to the activities of this great initiation. The African Investment Bank would be based in Libya and the project would be launched in 2011. One of the banks would control most of the investment in African countries. This would help the young African entrepreneurs who are struggling to secure a fund for their business. Another mistake. It would give competitiveness and reduce the capacity of Western investors who are the majority of African countries' company bosses, to date. The idea would also establish one of the best Central African banks. This bank would help African people to stop using the Western currency, such as today's dollar, which controls all the African currencies. To date, if the United States is in trouble and the dollar gets affected, then all African countries have to struggle, for the prices of food, transport and rent, among other commodities would go up, which frustrates the African poor families to live unhappily. The one African currency ideas would free Africa economically, by freeing all African currencies from the control of the dollar, to depend on themselves. This would weaken the dollar's strength in African business, by way of exchange, through gold values. These banks would be sponsored by Gaddafi, as the main investor, on the continent. The project plans would be started in 2011. The regret for Africans was that before the project started, in the same year, Gaddafi's dictatorship became a big issue within international affairs. Before, in the previous 38 years, there was very little attention on him within Western media. After the idea was announced, from 2009 Gaddafi became the big enemy of some Western countries' leaders until his end in 2011. He became the trouble president to his own people after many years of command. They turned rebellious and attacked their president, with the help of Western countries' weapons. The West failed to negotiate but used the facility way that continued to destroy African people's dreams, which is the military bases and the support of civil wars, the rebellions. His power was ended by the Libyan rebellions because he was a dictator, which ended the African dreams of the one African single currency. Would the world people believe that the Libyan people would destroy the dreams of all African people set by Gaddafi and their own dreams and kill their president, or the Western countries were responsible for ending those dreams? This is one of the questions that African generations would be continuing to ask themselves. They will learn much through our own mistakes about this world, about whom to believe, the media or their own positive mindset and leaders. We need to refocus on Gaddafi's leadership, as we have much to learn more about his great leadership, because his ideology was in the interest of all Africans. It is clear Gaddafi was fighting for the economic independence of African people and failed to free Africa. If the African countries were really united, they would support Gaddafi against his attackers, to accomplish his dream of a single African bank and currency that would benefit all African people to be economically free. However, division or the DTCTC system exposed him, and today we are continuing, in deep trouble with African economic independence. Let us all find a way to free ourselves and learn from our own mistakes by uniting our youth and countries with critical thinking, education, mindset development, and have one vision. If Gaddafi got support from the African Union countries, I believe these projects would be alive. However, because he did not get the support of his own African people, today we can still be claiming that he was a dictator because of what we have learned from the media propaganda. We also hear from some Western leaders who like to see us as Africans in pain. One of Gaddafi's quotes says, "How much longer will we allow these tyrants to do this?" I leave you with this. My ideology to African people is, even though our leaders have done wrong over the past, however, if they come to set good plans and programs that would benefit the citizens and are acting on them, we need to support them to build a better Africa. Gaddafi may have committed some bad acts, like most dictators or long-serving leaders. However, he worked much for the interest of his country and the African continent. This should remind us, as Africans, to honor his name and leadership. Fighter and leadership one Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Biography. Rolihlahla Mandela, also called Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, was born on the 18th of July 1918, at Mveto, a small village in the Eastern Cape Province, RSA. He died on the 5th of December 2013, at Johannesburg, a capital of Gauteng Province, RSA. He was the first black South African president from 1994 to 1999. He governed the country with a policy based on dismantling the legacy of apartheid through tackling institutionalized racism, poverty and inequality, and the development of racial reconciliation. From 1991 to 1997, he served as president of the African National Congress, ANC, one of the political parties that fought against racism and oppression against the apartheid regime for decades. Mandela's family: father, Gadla Henry Mfakani Azwa, mother, Nonkafi Nozakani. Mandela married 3 times. In 1944, he married Evelyn Toko Mace. The couple had 4 children: Thambile Mandela, Makazai Mandela, died after 9 months, Makatho Luanaka Mandela, and Pumla Makazai Mandela. He divorced in 1958. The same year he married again, Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela. They had 2 children, Zenani Mandela Dlamini and Zintsizwa Mandela. He divorced in 1996, and for the 3rd time, in 1998, he was married to Graça Machel until his death. Mandela's father Gadla was the chief by blood and custom of Mveto, part of the Thembu Kingdom, one of the Xhosa Nation clan or ethnic group's kingdom. He was also a member of the royal family of the Thembu. Xhosa people can trace their family history back to a specific forefather, a male ancestor, also referred to as clan. He belonged to the Madiba clan. Mandela was also called by his clan name Madiba, a term of respect. In the 1920s, Mandela's father was involved in a dispute that removed him from his position by the South African colony government's magistrate, which controlled the traditional chiefs. This was due to a complaint lodged against him, involving an ox that had got lost from its owner. The court order took all his fortune. This led him to lose his wealth and the title. This affected the family. Because of the circumstances, Mandela's parents moved to Knu, another small village in the Eastern Cape. It is where he lived his childhood. As a young black African, he also came across a few whites who appeared as grand to him. Later, a man named Mkla introduced Mandela and his mother to Christianity, as well as asked Mandela's parents to enroll him to school. Mandela started the school at the age of 7 years. From his first days at school, Mandela's teacher, Miss Mdingane, gave him a new name, Nelson, English name, because some Europeans were struggling to pronounce other African names, like Mandela's name Rulala, which means troublemaker, in Xhosa. In 1930, Mandela's father died of some type of lung disease, tuberculosis. Note: Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, published that his father died in 1927, while the Nelson Mandela Foundation timeline approves that his own handwriting document states the year of 1930. Later, Mandela was moved to Mkakuzini, another small village in the Eastern Cape, and placed under the care of his father's cousin Jongintaba Dalindibo, the regent of the Thembu people. Mandela attended his college at Clarkbury, one of the Eastern Cape Province's senior secondary school, also called Thembu College, and changed the colleges to join his cousin Justice at Heeltown, another college, located near Fort Beaufort, Eastern Cape Province, a Wesleyan Methodist college, in 1939. Mandela's philosophy of leadership was profoundly influenced by observing the regent and his courts, as well as by asking questions to satisfy his curiosity. He watched and learned from the ethnic groups' meetings that were regularly held at the Great Place. These were called as the Nidaros, and were held to discuss national matters. Everyone who wanted to speak did so and were free to attend the meetings. They were wise men who retained the knowledge of tribal history and customs in their heads and whose opinions carried great weight. These meetings helped Mandela to develop his leadership ideologies and learn the histories of the African continent and its people against the Western leaders. In between 1939 to 1940, they both attended the same college, with his cousin. At the end of their college, they returned home to find the regent had already selected the brides for them, without their knowledge. The bride price, lobola, had already been paid for them. The regent was acting in accordance with Thembu law and custom. Mandela and Justice were not in agreement. This was because Mandela's bride, selected by the regent, was long in love with Justice. They both failed to change the regent's decision. At the same period of 1941, the regent had travelled for a full week. They both used this opportunity to run away to Johannesburg, after selling some of the regent's cattle for transport and pocket money. They started to work for a minute company, as mine security officers. Later, they were dismissed from the mine when a leader named Palizo found out about their departure from Thembu without permission of the regent. They went to meet Dr. Alfred Big Zuma, a well-respected physician, an old friend of the regent, who assisted them to get back their job. However, because they never told the truth to Mr. Zuma, the same mine leader fired them again. They lost the job, and Mandela went to live with another relative. Mandela, with his dream to become a lawyer, was taken by one cousin to Walter Sisulu, the owner of a real estate office that specialized in properties for black Africans. Mandela proposed his intentions, to get a job and continue to study, part-time, for a law course. At the same time, Reverend Mabutho had pity on him and found him accommodation with his next-door neighbors, the Ksoma family. Sisulu asked a white friend lawyer, Lazar Seidelsky, to take him as an articled clerk. Seidelsky agreed to take him on as a clerk while he enrolled his BA degree, at the University of South Africa, UNISA. Mandela came into contact with many figure men, black and white, and understood much about the challenge that was needed to fight inequality and poverty. He faced many challenges financially, sometimes studying by candlelight, walking long distances due to lacking transport fares, in trouble gangster areas, because his salary was not fully satisfying his needs. Sometimes he struggled for food. However, with his determination, like all the great heroes in the world, he succeeded under these circumstances. He started to be involved in politics after joining the ANC and passed his final exams for BA, Bachelor of Arts, at UNISA, at the end of 1942. He graduated with a BA at the University of Fort Hare in 1943. He enrolled for part-time LLB, Bachelor of Laws degree, at the University of the Witwatersrand, WITS. In 1943, Dr. Mjombozi suggested the idea to form the ANC Youth League, ANCIL. In 1944, the ANC leaders formed the ANCIL with Oliver Tambo as secretary, Walter Sisulu as treasurer, and Anton Lambert as its first president. APMDA, Jordan Gabane, Lionel Mjombozi, Congress Mbata, David Bopape and Nelson Mandela were appointed as the executive committee of the ANCIL. In 1947, Mandela was elected to the executive committee of the Transvaal ANC and served under C.S. Ramoano, president of the Transvaal region. By the 1940s, a number of critical events occurred that shaped his political development and the direction of the struggle. In 1948, general elections took place, and the National Party won the majority seats. Its leadership came to power with the program of segregation, apartheid, as a new term of racial division. This frustrated the non-white South African leaders, causing them to fight against the new ideologies. In between the years of 1951 to 1952, Mandela worked in two different law firms, named Turblanche and Briggish, for about 1 year, Hellman and Michel, for months. In 1951, he was elected as the national president of the ANCIL. At the same period, he investigated a number of white firms and found out there were no black African law firms. Later, he gave up the completion of his LLB degree, after failing his exam several times. In July 1952, Mandela and other South African leaders conducted the Defiance Campaign, the rise of civil disobedience against some government laws at that time that led him and others to be charged under the Statutory Communism Act. He traveled around South Africa as a volunteer with other members and prepared to break apartheid laws. In August 1952, Mandela opened his own law office. Later, Oliver Tambo joined Mandela. Together, they established South Africa's first black law firm, the Mandela and Tambo Law Firm. In December 1952, Mandela and other 51 leaders around the country were arrested and charged under the Suppression of Communism Act and banned from attending any meetings or gatherings for 9 months. They could not, for example, attend any birthday party, or could not talk to more than one person at a time. This affected the ANC leaders. However, the ANC still operated under the Mandela Plan, or simply M-Plan. The idea was to set up communication systems that would allow the ANC to take decisions without calling a meeting. The following year, in September 1953, the renewed bans required Mandela to resign officially from the ANC, and Mandela's leadership was exercised secretly. Later, in December 1956, police arrested him from his home with a warrant for high treason. He was one of the 156 political arrested for charged with high treason. On the 21st of March 1960, police killed 69 people, among those who were protesting in Sharpeville, an RSA township, against the country's laws. This led to the country's first state of emergency, on the 8th of April 1960. The ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, parties were banned. Later, before the end of the treason trial, Mandela spoke at the Africa Conference, demanding the government to formulate a non-racial constitution. He said that should the government not agree, he would call for a national strike against South Africa before becoming the sovereign state. This was the period that the country was in the process of establishing the Republic of South Africa. On the 29th of March 1961, Mandela and 27 others were acquitted after they were accused of several acts against the laws. In the following month, on the 31st of May 1961, the Union came to an end, a new constitution was voted, and South Africa became a sovereign country as the Republic. Unfortunately, the Republic was still using some of the old racial laws. Later, Mandela got involved in the leading of the armed struggle and helped to establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, also abbreviated MK. This was launched on the 16th of December 1961. followed by a series of explosions taking place. In between January to July 1962, Mandela traveled widely in African countries and visited England to seek for support. He returned to South Africa and got arrested, accused of leaving the country without a permit and inciting workers to strike. He appeared in the South African courts, with several other members of the ANC and MK leaders. Other South African political party leaders were present too. He was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, starting in a Pretoria local prison, and was transferred to Cape Town's Robben Island prison on the 27th of May 1963. He was again returned to Pretoria on the 12th of June. In the same year, he joined 10 others on trial for damages, referred to as the Rivonia trial. On the 20th of April 1964, he delivered the now famous speech from the dock. "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an idea for which I am prepared to die." On the 11th of June 1964, Mandela and 7 other accused, Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mlipper, Dennis Goldberg, Elias Motsoaledi, and Andrew Mlangeni, were convicted, and on the 12th of June, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Goldberg was sent to Pretoria prison because he was white, while the others went to Robben Island. Mandela's prison service number was 466/64, which meant he was the 466th prisoner admitted to the island in 1964. Later, in 1968, Mandela's mother died. His request to attend the funeral was denied. Furthermore, in 1969 his son Thembi died in car accident. His request to attend the funeral was denied. On the 31st of March 1982, Mandela was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison, in Cape Town, with Sisulu, Mlipper, and Mlangeni. Kathrada joined them in October. In the following years, the International and African Union put pressure on the apartheid government, after the Angola civil wars. This led the South Africans to end the apartheid government. This happened when the Cuba Army-backed People's Armed Forces of Liberation of Angola, FAPLA, took control of all Angola's land occupied by the South African Defence Force, SADF, who assisted the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, Angolan's rebellion party. Furthermore, in 1987, Cuba and the Soviet Union, modern Russia, backed the FAPLA, with some of Namibia's liberation movement forces called SWAPO. Together, they took some Namibia areas, at the Battle of Cuito-Cuana Vale, in 1988, which was controlled by SAD for years. Following the ANC SWAPO, Cubans, the Angolans and the Soviet armies, with other supports from African nation forces, were preparing to overthrow the apartheid government in South Africa. This forced the apartheid government of South Africa to negotiate with SWAPO for Namibia independence achieved in 1990 and with South Africa political parties, mainly ANC for South African citizens' freedom achieved in 1994. During the negotiations for freedom, many other blacks, and some white leaders, including some other African nations' leaders, assisted the South African fighters' political parties to end apartheid. To date, these are some of South Africa's remarkable fighters. Since the start of apartheid: John Tengo Jabavu, born 1859, died 1921; Solomon Shakisho Platt, 1876 to 1832; Walter Benson Ubusna, 1858 to 1936; Clements Kadali, 1896 to 1951; AWG Champion, 1893 to 1975; Steve Biko, 1946 to 1977; Robert Sobuk, 1924 to 1978; Oliver Tambo, 1917–1993; Walter Sisulu, 1912 to 2003, and Nelson Mandela, 1918 to 2013, among others. In addition, the majority of all South African blacks, Indians, coloreds and some white citizens, throughout the year 1990, were all against apartheid and fought for their peace. This led to the end of apartheid in between 1990 to 1994, and the celebration day named Freedom Day was selected to be the 27th of April 1994. Mandela was voted as South African president in 1994. Today we can learn much about Mandela's achievement, who never gave up on his positive mindset. He achieved his dreams in his lifetime because he was determined and never gave up. The same goes for all Africans. If we all believe and work hard, we will make Africa a great continent in the world. In conclusion, the fight of the African people lasted for centuries, until the decolonization era. The first 5 northern African countries were freed from the colonialists, starting with Egypt in 1922, followed by Libya in 1951, then Sudan, Tunisia, and Morocco in 1956. This was done under some great African leaders' efforts. Later, a remarkable era started in 1957, after the achievement of the Kwame Nkrumah dream, to free Ghana. This forced the liberations of the majority of African countries from colonization in the year 1960. While a few countries were still colonies, South Africa gained independence in 1910 from Britain, and the Republic of South Africa was declared in 1961. The RSA government had taken power and continued with systems that separated ethnics and color, black, colored and Indian people separated from white, which was created in the 1948 apartheid. Thousands of South African people died during apartheid, protesting against this system before they were finally granted their freedom in 1994. On the 26th of April 1994, South Africa's new flag was raised, and a new constitution was declared. Following on the day of the 27th of April 1994, a Bill of Rights took effect and the day is referred to as the Freedom Day. During this moment of transition, the DTCTC system caused confusion among the South African black peoples during the negotiation of a new constitution. Apartheid confusion spread between some black ethnic groups, like the AmaZulu and Amaxhosa people conflict. The conflicts broke out, sometimes stoked by reactionary white groups within the security establishment, still in control of the country. This conflict happened largely outside the influence of the ANC and other political parties' leadership, who were engaged in negotiating for a new South African constitution. Because of unity, all South African political parties, with some international help, succeeded to free the country from the apartheid regime. After the end of the decolonization era, the colonization has taken another form of controlling the mindset within Africans. This caused and has continued to lead the African people to fight against each other, because of the confusion among them. Alternately, this is also due to the lack of strong leadership and education systems. Many countries are still in trouble, such as Sudan and DRC, among others. Citizens have continued as sufferers for years and years. This is the result of the effect of some of our African brothers and sisters' mindset, with the support of some Western countries' leaders. The ex-colonizers' leaders continue to make a business of heavy weapons and in other types of assistance, like media systems, with some radical African leaders. These have led us to unnecessary civil wars and strikes that destabilize the evolutions of our continent. The misleading of the African mindset has been entrenched in the continent in many forms of destruction of humanity. For example, in the years 2007, 2008 and 2015, the xenophobia that raised its head, with a small group of South African black minority attacking other black African nation migrants residing in South Africa, due to unemployment and destabilization in other African countries. This xenophobia, to some extent, destroyed the image of South Africa's leaders in the eyes of other African countries. However, eventually, the South African government managed to control the violence. The weakness of African educational systems, which are not based on mindset development, continues to lack the development of the continent. These are also due to the fights between black against black or Africans against Africans. The xenophobia effect is not only restricted to the South African nation but in the entire African countries in many forms. Another example, the Congo-Brazzaville. In the year between 2014 and 2015, due to many reasons linked to poverty, several acts of criminality occurred throughout the country. The Republic of Congo authorities blamed it on members of Kuluna, criminal gangs, from neighboring DRC who migrated to Congo. The government started Operation Bati Yabakalo, which means slap of the elders in Lingala language, which was set and focused on illegal migrants. Many of our African families who resided in the Congo-Brazzaville for several years were deported back from Congo-Brazzaville to the Democratic Republic of Congo in July 2015. Some of the victims never committed criminal acts. The Republic of Congo government failed at some point to introduce proper methods to deal with criminals. Nevertheless, after months, the operation came to an end, and the country returned to normality. The Republic of Zambia also experienced the same, as the riots in the Congo, in another form. The uprisings of the Zambian people against our fellow African Rwandan families in April 2016. The uprising started after the rumors spread throughout the country that Rwandans were behind recent ritual killings of 2 Zambians. Later, the Home Affairs Minister reported that more than 250 people had been arrested after more than 60 Rwandan-owned shops were looted in 2 days of violence. Later, the government had taken control of the situation. These examples can also be found in other African countries, historically. It seems like we, as Africans, have much power to stand up to kill our own African families who reside in our local country, for any mistake they made or are alleged to have made. However, we continue to fail to fight our own mindset controlled by the Western countries' leaders. They supply us with weapons and sometimes with the news that leads us to kill or fight each other. Today the majority of African families have kept quiet and some have continued to praise the weapon suppliers or do see the West as our gods. Some of the great leaders around the world, like in Mandela's leadership, have inspired the world by not supporting the confusion in some African people's mindset, by concentrating on doing everything to stop the violence between black ethnic groups and the former white leadership. He led the country in harmony and worked with all races as one united nation, in which he leaves a positive image of South Africa today. South Africa has become one of the most peaceful countries in Africa, and this led Mandela to win the Nobel Peace Prize 1993. His speech, made on the 20th of April 1964, as one of his visions to fight against white and black dominations, equality, was realized. Today, in 2018, he is the living vision of all South Africans, with all people getting along better and better. This is also a vision that we as Africans are called to continue to fight for our children, to live peacefully in all the African nations, to live alongside black, colored and white, at peace, with all different religions, believers, working in harmony. Despite the trauma of the colonial economy, it is up to us to free ourselves. It's also the same vision the African Youth Inventions is aiming to achieve. This is to lead Africans to move beyond our mindset and set strong institution systems which will end the control of the Western leaders over our leadership and economies. This includes learning much about how to solve Africa problems and shun confusion, by working together with all African races, blacks, whites and other colors, with all ethnic groups, as one nation. The Mandela legacy is the start of the growth of Africa as a wealth of ideologies to adopt. Mandela was one of the last great fighters and leaders for African liberation, initiated by many other African fighters and heroes, and the one well-known, Kwame Nkrumah. It is our duty to carry this vision and accomplish the great Africa dream of freedom. We are no longer in the colonization or white supremacy era. However, we still have much confusion within our leadership and some people in the continent. It is our duty to invent new systems that will re-educate strongly the African kids and build a great continent. We must learn from the several African fighters, some of whom have been highlighted throughout this book. Kwame, Patrice, Jomo and other African leaders, who fought and managed to free African countries from colonization. Other leaders could not achieve their dreams due to the DTCTC systems, like Sankara and Gaddafi, whose ideas were of freeing the Africans, economically and ideologically, to stop the Western hands on African leaders and economic control. Currently, many peace fighters and leaders are continuing to lead the fight to end the domination of the DTCTC systems. We end off with one of Africa's most visionary leaders who achieved his dream of uniting South African citizens. The Mandela strategy was to re-educate and fight, with no violence, by living together with our opponents, albeit with vision. By working hard to reach them and not to let them manipulate our mindset. When we do so, we may gain respect, and encourage treating each other as brothers and sisters and not as superior to others. Conversely, the fight in Africa is not yet finished, as most of our leaders' mindsets are struggling to finish the fight. Some would like to take us back to the past by continuing fighting in old ways filled with violence, and some continuing to support the DTCTC systems. We have to follow Mandela's ideologies to live and die together. As proof of the Mandela legacy, after 58 years of African countries' liberation, South Africa has the highest stability in political and judicial views. The country has one of the highest numbers of higher institutions, with some advance in technologies in the 21st century Africa. This shows the great impact of the continent, where thousands of youths from several countries are getting the education in these institutions. It also helped me to get knowledge that allowed me to write this book. Recognition also goes to other Africans, who are planning and are making a change throughout our continent. This legacy of working in harmony can be seen as an inspiration to other African countries. For example, in Nigeria, the great leaders have been leading and controlling one of the top African economic countries. This is simplistic, as our basic education system is in tatters and we have some of the worst performance indicators in basic education throughout the continent. I would like to thank all leaders who contributed towards the change in many African countries, as well as the family members of the 6 late heroes mentioned throughout this book, for their beloved late brothers, or parent, legacies, which inspire and shows us the ways to respond to our opponents. This will allow African youth and leaders to stand together and reshape our systems of education for the benefit of the next generations. In order to banish the DTCTC system and create new systems that will promote better living conditions for African people. Thanks for listening to the Section 2 of Misleading of the African Mindset book written by Emery Lukambo. The audiobook 4 is available, which record the Section 3 of the book, African Religion, Conflicts and Leaders. By searching the African Youth Inventions channel into YouTube and download or listening to the rest of audiobook 1, 2 and 4 for free. You can purchase the full book. Copy is available into all the exclusive bookshops around South Africa. For all people in and out of South Africa, you can also purchase the electronic copy or order the paperback under the African Youth Inventions website at www.africanyouthinventions.co.za. Please do not forget to subscribe to African Youth Inventions YouTube channel. We would like to keep you updated about what projects coming and hearing your suggestions for the benefit of all people live in Africa and the rest of the world. You may also follow us on Twitter and like or join our Facebook page and group. Thanks again.